The phone rang at 3:51 in the afternoon on the worst Tuesday Dara Mack had lived through in a year that had produced real competition for the title, and she nearly let it go to voicemail. She was in the records basement of St. Benedict's Hospital, for flights below the wards and the waiting rooms and the world where things were still moving, doing what she'd done for 4 years in this building. Pulling intake files, logging discharge dates, cataloging the paper record of other people's emergencies. She was good at the work. Good enough that her supervisor had stopped checking her numbers, which left her the basement largely to herself for 8 hours at a stretch. The fluorescent lights down here flickered every afternoon at 3:45 without fail, a brief strobe that made the filing cabinets look like they were underwater, and then settled back to their home. Dara had stopped noticing it months ago. What she was noticing was the balance in her checking account. She'd checked it twice that morning. $180. Rent was due yesterday. Not the first time. Not even the third. The property management company had stopped calling and started mailing letters in that particular sequence that meant the next envelope would come from a law office. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to Maya's teacher had sent a note home the week before about the field trip fee. $35. Dara had said she'd bring the envelope Monday. It was now Tuesday. She hadn't brought the envelope. She'd cut a strip of cardboard from a cereal box that morning and pressed it into the sole of Maya's left shoe before her daughter woke up, hoping she wouldn't notice. Maya had noticed. She hadn't said anything about it. She was 8 years old and had already learned when not to say things. The phone showed a Caldwell area code she didn't recognize. She answered because she was out of the habit of being cautious about small things. Caution was for people with something to lose. Miss Mack. The voice was measured, older, precise in the way of someone who'd spent a career delivering news that required care. My name is Leonard Pruitt. I'm an attorney practicing in Caldwell. I've been trying to reach you for several days. I had a number disconnect. She paused. Who are you calling about? Your grandmother. Celestine Mack. He stopped, giving the next part space. She passed away 3 weeks ago. I'm very sorry. Dara set the file she'd been holding back onto the desk. The fluorescent light above her flickered once and held. She'd known, in the way you know things you've decided not to examine. Celestine had called every Sunday without exception for 12 years, and the calls had stopped in September, and Dara had told herself the old woman was tired, that she'd call on Saturday instead, that sometimes connections were bad. She'd told herself a dozen easy things. She was 91, Leonard Pruitt said gently. She went peacefully, in the night. She'd been in good health until the final weeks. Dara's throat tightened. Thank you for letting me know. Miss Mack, I'm calling because Celestine named you as her sole beneficiary. She left a will, executed through my office. She left you everything she had. Everything from a woman who'd been living on Social Security and a nurse's pension, who'd given most of her possessions to a cousin in Cleveland years before. Dara appreciated the gesture. It would not change the number in her account. There's a property, Leonard Pruitt said, and something in the controlled delivery of those 3 words made her sit up. What kind of property? Harmon County General Hospital. On Archer Road. Your grandmother held the deed to it. Has been paying the property taxes since 1991. The name was familiar the way certain Caldwell landmarks were familiar. Things you'd driven past so many times they stopped registering as objects and became background. For stories of Victorian brick on the east side. Chain-link fencing, boarded windows, condemned signs. The building the city had been arguing about for 15 years, that teenagers dared each other to enter on Halloween, that appeared in every long-range development plan as a problem to be solved. How did my grandmother own that building? He cleared his throat. There's a letter she left for you. She was specific about how she wanted it delivered. In person, at my office. She said you'd have questions the letter would answer better than I could. She looked at the basement around her. The filing cabinets. The flickering light. The granola bar she'd been eating when the phone rang. Can I come this afternoon? I'll be here. She left a note on her supervisor's desk about a family emergency, which was not untrue, and drove to Main Street. Leonard Pruitt's office was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building between a closed travel agency and a copy shop. Simple furnishings. Files organized with the precision of long practice. He was in his 70s, lean, with the kind of stillness that came from decades of listening before speaking. He had a folder already open on the desk when she arrived. He pushed the deed across first. The property described therein, approximately 3.4 acres, all structures. The name in the ownership line was Celestine and Mack. Transfer date March 14, 1991. How did she get it? Dr. Eleanor Harmon died in February of that year. Last surviving member of the family that built and ran the hospital from 1921 until it closed in 1987. No living relatives who wanted the building. She left it to your grandmother. His hands were folded on the desk. Celestine was Eleanor's private nurse for 11 years. Was there a reason Eleanor chose her specifically? He paused. There's a letter Celestine left for you. She said it would explain more than she'd been able to say. Out loud. He produced an envelope, cream paper, sealed with wax, Celestine's careful handwriting on the front. And these. A key ring with 2 keys on a cloth ribbon that had faded from dark green to something closer to gray. One key was large, brass, worn smooth from years of use. The other was smaller, newer looking. There's a legal matter you should understand before you visit the property. His voice shifted. The city of Caldwell issued a demolition order against the building 6 weeks ago. The order was based on structural assessments commissioned at the request of a development company called Whitmore Group. They've been trying to acquire that land for 4 years. Scheduled demolition is 32 days from today. She absorbed this. What are my options? As property owner of record, you have standing to contest the demolition. You'd need a preservation attorney and a counter-assessment. The city will push back, and so will Whitmore. He paused. The developer's interest is in the land itself. The building, from their perspective, is an obstacle. What's the land worth to them? He named a number. She kept her face still. She picked up the keys. The brass one was heavy, worn to a particular smoothness that came from thousands of uses. The small one was lighter, more precise. She put them in her coat pocket and stood. I want to see it today. I'd expect nothing less. He handed her a business card. My cell number. Call after you've been inside. She drove to Maya's school and sat in the pickup line with both hands on the wheel. Her daughter came down the front steps with the focused authority of someone who'd decided backpacks should be worn on one shoulder regardless of what the school health newsletter said about spinal alignment. She climbed in, buckled her seatbelt, and studied her mother's face for 3 seconds. You have the thinking hard look. Your great-grandmother Celestine passed away. Maya was quiet for a moment. The one who called on Sundays? Yes. I'm sorry, Mommy. Dara pulled out of the parking lot. We're going somewhere before home. Something she left us. Maya watched the street pass. Is it the good kind of something or the hard kind? Dara thought about the deed, the keys, the sealed letter she hadn't opened yet. Probably both. Harmon County General appeared around the long curve on Archer Road and Dara slowed, without meaning to. She'd forgotten its scale. For full stories of red brick with a broad Victorian facade, arched windows mostly boarded, a portico with columns that had settled into a slight lean without falling. The chain-link fencing posted every 10 feet with signs. Condemned. No trespassing. Danger. Structural hazard. Someone had painted the word ghost across the front face of the building in letters 8 feet tall. The paint weathered now to a faded rust orange. Maya pressed her face close to the window. What is that? A hospital. It closed before I was born. It looks like it's watching. Dara looked at the building. She thought, unreasonably, that Maya was right. The padlock on the gate was seized from weather, but the large brass key freed it after a moment of patient pressure. She pushed through, Maya beside her, and they walked up the cracked concrete path through dead grass and dried weeds. The front steps were wide stone, chipped at the corners but solid. The oak doors were dark with age, the brass handles turned to dull green. The same key opened the front door. The smell came first. Old plaster and paper, and underneath both a mineral cold that didn't belong to the season, the smell of enclosed space, of decades without ventilation. Maya wrinkled her nose but didn't comment. They stepped into the entrance hall and let their eyes adjust. Dara had expected damage. The evidence of intrusion that always accumulated in abandoned buildings. There was some of that. Beer cans rusted orange in the far corner, names carved into the wood paneling near the door, a chair lying on its side. But the space itself was intact in ways she hadn't anticipated. Black and white hexagonal tile across the floor, cracked in a few places, unbroken mostly. A wide staircase curving up to the second floor, its banister standing, the wood darkened to near black, but solid when she pressed her hand against it. On either side of the entrance hall, corridors stretched into shadow. A reception desk sat in the center, the counter surface buried under 37 years of accumulated dust. The walls held photographs, 8 by 10 black and whites in plain frames, images of the hospital at various points in its history. A dedication ceremony from what looked like the 1920s, men in suits and women in long dresses gathered on the front steps, all of them squinting against the sun. A ward room with nurses in white caps moving between rows of beds, the perspective making the room look longer than it could have been. And then, at the far end of the entrance hall near the staircase, a formal portrait. A man in his 60s, white coat, a direct and settled gaze. The brass nameplate below it read, Dr. Frederick J. Harmon, founder, 1921. She stood before the portrait for a long moment. Frederick Harmon looked like someone who made decisions carefully and held to them once made. Mom. Maya was standing at a display case against the wall near the staircase, glass-fronted, the kind that might once have held awards or commemorative items. Most of its shelves were empty, but on the center shelf, positioned with obvious care, sat a small carved wooden bird. Wings folded, precise in its detail, and it had no dust on it, which in a building where everything else carried 37 years of accumulation meant someone had been here recently. She tried the case latch. It opened. She picked up the bird carefully and turned it over. Nothing on the base. No inscription, no initials. Just the object itself, placed where someone who knew to look would find it. She set it back and opened Celestine's letter. For pages, front and back, the lines growing closer together toward the end, as if she'd run out of space and couldn't bear to stop. My Dara, by the time you read this I'll be gone, and I hope you'll forgive me for what I kept from you. I kept it because I didn't know what else to do with it, and because the woman who told it to me asked me to wait for the right person. I have believed for years that you are that person. I nursed Eleanor Harmon from 1980 until she died in February of 1991. She was Frederick Harmon's granddaughter and the last of that family. She carried a secret for 36 years before she could bring herself to tell anyone. In those final months, she told me, Frederick Harmon was not only a physician. He was a reader of what was coming in the world before most people allowed themselves to read it clearly. Between 1935 and 1941, he acquired paintings, manuscripts, and historical documents. He bought from families who were leaving Europe under terrible circumstances, families who needed money quickly and could not wait for better offers. He tried to pay fairly. He kept records of every acquisition because he understood that someday someone would need to account for how these things changed hands. He believed that what he was acquiring was worth saving, and that if he didn't save it, it would be destroyed or dispersed or simply lost. He brought those things to Caldwell, Ohio. He built them a home beneath this hospital. There is a vault under the basement level. Frederick had it constructed in 1938, the same year he began acquiring in earnest. He sealed it in September of 1942, 3 months before he died. His wife Margaret knew about it. Margaret told Eleanor on her deathbed in 1955. Eleanor spent the next 36 years deciding what to do about it and never reached a decision that satisfied her. She gave the building to me because she trusted me and because she said it needed someone who would eventually be ready. I spent 30 years being a poor steward of that trust. I never opened the vault. I never contacted anyone who might help. I told myself I was waiting for the right time, but the right time never came because I was afraid. I'm ashamed of that, Dara. I am deeply ashamed of it. Here is what I know for certain. What Frederick sealed in 1942 is still there. The building sat empty, and the city argued about it, and the developers circled it, and none of them knew what they were circling. You work with archives. You understand that some things are worth preserving, and you know how to handle what is old and fragile and important. That's why this belongs to you now. The vault is in the basement. East corridor. Follow it to the end, to the room marked with a red cross. Behind the shelving unit on the north wall there is a door. The small key will open it. Please be careful, my darling girl. There are people who've been trying to get that land for years. They don't know about the vault, but they are not gentle. Go see what Frederick left. Then decide what comes next. I love you. I have always loved you. I am sorry it took me this long to be brave enough to give you this. Your grandmother, Celestine. Dara folded the letter and held it in both hands and stood in the entrance hall of the abandoned hospital with Frederick Harmon's portrait watching from the far wall. The building creaked around her, a deep structural sound, not distress, just the settling of old materials. November light pushed through the gaps in the window boards in thin gray blades. Maya had gone quiet beside her, reading her mother's stillness. "Mom, are we going to the basement?" "Yes, but I want to see upstairs first." They took the main staircase slowly, one hand on the banister that held firm despite its age. The second floor was long hallways, doors to patient rooms standing open. Inside the rooms, the metal bed frames were still in place, the mattresses long since removed or disintegrated. Window boards let in narrow lines of light. The floor was wood here, boards that creaked underfoot, still solid. A nurse is stationed at the center of the floor, the counter clear, the shelves above it still holding a few binders with dates from the early 1980s on their spines. Maya looked into one of the patient rooms from the doorway. People got better in there, and some of them didn't. Dara kept her voice gentle. That's what hospitals are. Both things at once. Maya thought about this. Then they're important buildings. They are. She pulled the door to one of the rooms open fully and stood looking at the window. The board over it had cracked along one edge and light came through in a wider band than the others, falling across the floor in a long pale rectangle. The view through the gap showed Archer Road, the chain-link fence, and beyond it the distribution warehouse that had gone up sometime in the past decade. She thought about people lying in that room 60 years ago, looking out that window, watching the street below. She thought about what was under the floor she was standing on. She kept going up. The third floor was darker, more boards across the windows, the light narrow and stripped down. Patient rooms here too, but smaller, fewer of them, and at the far end a pair of double doors that opened into what had been an operating theater. The space was circular, tiered seating around a central floor, the kind of configuration that had been standard in teaching hospitals of the early 20th century. A gallery above for observers. The central operating table was gone, but the drainage gutters in the floor were still there, and the tile around them was intact. The overhead lighting armature hung empty, its bulbs removed decades ago, but the mechanism itself was intact, a wide-armed metal frame that could have been swung in any direction to direct light where it was needed. She stood in the gallery tier and looked down at the operating floor and tried to imagine Frederick Harmon working in this space. A physician who'd also been spending those same years quietly corresponding with dealers in Paris, arranging to bring paintings and manuscripts across an ocean to a room he'd had built in the basement of the building where he spent his working life. Two things at once. The daily work of a doctor and the parallel, private work of someone who understood that certain things needed saving and that no institution was going to do it. Dara stood in the center of the room and looked up at the ceiling, at the dome above the operating theater, glass that had been painted over from outside, but still let through a faint diffuse light. She thought about the people who'd worked in this room, what they'd saved and what they hadn't been able to save. The ordinary daily weight of a place like this. Maya was standing beside one of the observation chairs in the gallery tier, running her hand along the wooden armrest. People used to watch from up here? Medical students, mostly, learning how it was done by watching people who knew. Her daughter considered this. Like how you showed me to sew a button. Something like that, yes. More consequential. They found the stairs to the fourth floor, but the door at the top was sealed, the frame swollen with age and damp, and after 2 attempts she decided against forcing it. What was up there could wait. What she needed was below. She took the stairs back down, found the stairwell at the far end of the east corridor, behind a door whose hinges screamed when she pushed it open. The stairs were concrete, the walls bare plaster. Her phone flashlight cut a narrow path through the dark. The basement air hit them at the bottom of the stairs, colder, heavier, the smell of enclosed concrete and old metal. Corridors ran in both directions. Storage rooms off the main hallway, doors standing open, shelves mostly empty. Some medical equipment left behind when the hospital closed, a wheelchair, missing one wheel, for stands stacked against a wall, a cart with a cracked plastic top under a torn canvas cover. She went east. Her flashlight caught the numbers above each storage room door in a system that must have meant something once. The room at the end of the east corridor had a red cross painted on the door in paint so old it had faded from red to a tired brownish rust. The brass key opened it. Inside, a storage room 20 feet by 30, industrial metal shelving units along every wall. Most shelves empty. A few boxes still in place from when the hospital closed, bandage packaging, equipment supply catalogs, a stack of intake forms from 1986. She moved to the north wall shelving unit. Heavy industrial steel, bolted to the floor at 2 points she could see. She went to the right end and pressed sideways into the gap between the unit and the wall. 18 inches, maybe 20. She moved along the concrete wall with the flashlight held ahead of her. The door was there, flush with the concrete, painted the same color as the wall, invisible unless you knew where to look. No handle. A keyhole, brass, small. She brought up the small key and her hand was not entirely steady. It slid in, turned with a click that was quiet and precise. The door swung inward on hinges that made no sound at all. Beyond it, stairs going down. Not old stairs. Poured concrete, smooth and finished, a metal railing bolted to the wall. Someone had built these stairs with care and maintained them. She went first. Maya stayed in the doorway above, flashlight beam coming from behind her. She counted 17 steps to the bottom. She swept her light across what was there and stood very still. The room was roughly 40 feet by 40, concrete walls, ceiling high enough to stand under comfortably. The walls were dry, no water damage, no staining. The air was cold, but not damp, and the contents of it had been arranged with a care that made her stop breathing for a moment. Against the far wall, paintings in protective wrappings, cloth and acid-free paper in fitted casings, each piece given its own space, positioned carefully rather than stacked. She counted without moving. She stopped at 22, and there were more behind those. Along the right wall, shelving units held wooden cases, each one latched, each one labeled in a handwriting she didn't recognize. The labels were in German. Some had dates below the words. Along the left wall, a bank of flat drawers, the archival kind used for maps and oversized documents, stacked 4 high across the full length of the room. The kind she'd used herself at work. At the back, beside the painting stacks, 3 padlocked metal trunks. In the center of the room, a work table. On it, a single object under an embroidered cloth, something roughly the size of a briefcase. An old oil lantern sat beside it, unlit, and a single sheet of paper held flat by a glass paperweight. She crossed to the table and picked up the paper carefully. The handwriting was not Celestine's. Formal, precise, every letter fully formed. To whoever finds this. I built this room in 1938 because I understood what was coming before most people permitted themselves to understand it. I will spare you the details of what I acquired and how, except to say that I acquired it lawfully, that I paid fairly when fair payment was possible, and that I believe these pieces were worth preserving more than I believed anything about accumulation or personal gain. I do not know when this room will be opened, or by whom. I will be dead by then, in all likelihood. I have instructed my wife to pass this knowledge only to someone she trusts completely, and I trust that she will honor that. What I leave here is not treasure. It is history. It is the evidence that beauty existed before the worst years, and that some people chose to protect it when the easier thing would have been to look away. Whatever you decide to do with what I've left, please do it honestly. That is all I ask. Frederick James Harmon, September 12, 1942. She read it 3 times. The final line she read a 4th time by itself. Please do it honestly. Maya's voice came down from the top of the stairs, steady but carrying a thin edge of worry. Mom, are you okay? Come down here. Her daughter came carefully, one hand on the railing, her own small flashlight bobbing. She stepped off the last stair into the room and stopped. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "What is all of this?" Dara looked at the wrapped paintings, at the labeled cases on the shelves, at the flat drawers, at the 3 locked trunks. Something someone kept safe for a very long time. Maya moved slowly along the left wall, not touching, just looking. She stopped at the flat drawers and studied the construction. She went to the work table and stood before the covered object, examining the embroidered cloth without reaching for it. Her flashlight found a detail near the corner. "Mom, there's a bird on this." Dara came over. The embroidery was a small image near the bottom corner of the cloth, worked in dark thread on dark fabric, easy to miss. A bird in flight, wings spread wide. The same bird as the carved figure upstairs in the display case. She photographed everything, moving around the room in slow, deliberate passes, phone held steady, flashlight in the other hand. The paintings through their wrappings, the edges and corners she could see. The labeled wooden cases. Each flat drawer she pulled open just far enough to see the top contents without disturbing anything. Handwritten documents in German and French, drawings, what appeared to be authentication records. All of it organized in a way that spoke of someone who'd planned for this to be readable by a stranger, years or decades later, by someone who hadn't been there when any of it happened. She worked the flat drawers from left to right. The system became clear as she moved along the wall. Each drawer was labeled in pencil on its front face, a number and a letter. The numbers appeared to correspond to the wooden cases on the shelving unit across the room. In one drawer she found a stack of photographs, printed on paper that had yellowed at the edges, images of artworks laid flat or propped against walls. Documentation photographs, the kind taken when condition and appearance needed to be on record. In the fifth drawer she pulled open, she found something she hadn't expected, a handmade index. Frederick Harmon had prepared a master list of everything in the room. 31 entries in a careful column, each with a description in English followed by notes in German and French. Artist, medium, approximate dimensions, acquisition date, acquisition location, name of seller, price paid. The prices were recorded in whatever currency had been used at the point of sale, francs, marks, guilders, with converted dollar values in parentheses. She photographed the index page by page, for pages in total, and stood in the vault with the image of it on her phone screen and understood for the first time what she was actually holding. Every single entry had a provenance note, where the piece had been before Frederick acquired it, who had owned it before the person he'd bought it from. In several cases, the chain of ownership went back decades, longer than Frederick himself had lived. He hadn't just acquired things and brought them here. He'd researched their histories before the transactions were complete, and he'd put what he found into writing. A physician in Caldwell, Ohio, corresponding with dealers in Paris and Amsterdam, reconstructing the ownership histories of paintings and manuscripts, paying attention to the circumstances under which things were being sold. She thought about his note on the work table. Please do it honestly. He'd been trying to do that from the beginning. The covered object on the table she left alone. When she climbed back up the stairs and locked the door behind her, she stood with her hand flat against the concrete wall beside the keyhole. She could feel the cold of the wall through her palm. 82 years. She locked the outer storage room behind them and walked back through the east corridor, up the stairs, through the entrance hall. She paused at Frederick Harmon's portrait on the way out. The man who'd built a hospital and then built something else underneath it, something quieter and less publicly admired. She picked up the wooden bird from the display case as she passed it. Outside, the November afternoon had gone gray and cold. Maya took her mother's hand without being asked. At the car, Dara sat with the engine running for a moment before pulling out. Her phone lit up. A number she didn't recognize. Gerald Crane, the voice said when she answered. I'm the president of Whitmore Development Group. I understand you've become the owner of record on the Harmon property. I'd like to speak with you before you make any decisions. We'd take very good care of you. Better than your current situation suggests you're in a position to manage on your own. If you'll forgive me for being direct. The directness was practiced, designed to feel like honesty. I'm not ready to discuss the property yet. The demolition order is in 32 days. That's a real deadline, not a soft one. The city is committed to the process. He paused. There's no advantage in waiting. I'll be in touch when I'm ready. She ended the call before he could respond. Maya was watching her from the back seat. Who was that? Someone who wants the building. Do we want the building? Dara looked at the hospital through the windshield. At the ghost lettering and the boarded windows and the chain-link fence and the 4 stories of red brick that had been standing in this spot for 103 years. I think we need to figure out what we have before we decide what we want. She drove 3 blocks before she remembered the second envelope. Leonard Pruitt had given it to her at the end of their meeting with a note on the outside in Celestine's writing. Open this after you've seen the building. She pulled over on a side street and opened it. 1 page, briefer than the first letter. Dara, if you're reading this, you went to the hospital and found the room below it. Call Daniel Voss. His number is below. He spent 20 years working for the Art Loss Register, tracking private collections for evidence of wartime acquisitions. Eleanor Harmon contacted him in 1987 when the hospital closed. She was planning to work with him and lost her nerve. He has been waiting 30 years for someone connected to this building to reach out. He is the only person who can help you understand what you have. Do not tell anyone else yet. The wrong people learning about this before you do would be very bad. You know enough to understand what I mean by that. One more thing. The object under the cloth on the work table in the vault. Frederick left specific instructions about it with Eleanor before he died. He called it the key to understanding everything else. Do not open it alone. Wait until Daniel Voss can be there. One final thing. In 1988, Eleanor had 3 independent appraisers assess the collection using Frederick's documentation, working without entering the vault. Their combined estimate was between $200 and $400 million. That was in 1988. All my love, always. Celestine. Dara read the last number twice. She read it a third time. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. She put the envelope back in her coat pocket and sat with the engine running and the heat pushing against the November cold and tried to measure what she was now holding. The drive home was quiet. Maya fell asleep in the back seat 10 minutes from the apartment, her head against the window, the wooden bird held in both hands in her lap. That night, with Maya asleep and the apartment silent, Dara sat at the kitchen table with both letters spread before her and her legal pad and the wooden bird in the center between them. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to the number Celestine had written for Daniel Voss. My name is Dara Mack. My grandmother Celestine Mack inherited Harmon County General Hospital from Eleanor Harmon in 1991. I've seen the building and the room below it. I think we need to talk. The response came in under 3 minutes. I've been expecting this. When can we meet? Tomorrow morning. Can you come to the building? His response was one word. Yes. She sat for a long time after that, reading Celestine's letters again, reading Frederick Harmon's note from the table in the vault. She thought about the chain of people who'd carried this across 82 years. Frederick sealing the room in 1942 and dying 3 months later. Margaret telling Eleanor on her deathbed in 1955. Eleanor holding it for 36 years and giving it to a nurse she trusted. Celestine holding it for 30 more years and giving it to a granddaughter she believed in. For people, 82 years. Her phone lit up. Gerald Crane, a text this time. Miss Mack, I understand from my colleagues that you visited the property today. I'd encourage you not to make hasty decisions. The city's structural assessment was conducted by licensed engineers. The building is a genuine public safety hazard. Contesting the demolition order will cost you considerably more than cooperating would. I have a reasonable offer prepared, and I'd prefer a conversation before this becomes adversarial. She put the phone face down. She thought about structural assessments commissioned by the developer who wanted the land. She thought about how those assessments tended to conclude. She picked up her phone again and called Leonard Pruitt's cell number. He answered on the second ring. I need the name of a preservation attorney. Tonight, if possible. She heard him moving papers. There's a firm in Cleveland. Patricia Chen handles demolition contests. She's won 3 in the past 4 years. He paused. She's not inexpensive. Dara looked at the figure she'd written in the corner of her legal pad. The 1988 appraisal estimate. Get me her number. She called Patricia Chun, a woman with a direct, efficient voice that conveyed someone who spent her days running toward problems rather than away from them. Dara gave her a summary, kept it to the facts. The property, the demolition order, the 32-day timeline. She said nothing about the vault. Patricia Chin asked 3 questions and said she could file a motion to stay the demolition within 48 hours. The retainer was more than Dara had. She said she could have it transferred from the estate account. Leonard Pruitt, when she called him back, confirmed there were funds. He also mentioned something she hadn't known. Celestine had contracted a maintenance company in 2019 to perform structural inspection and minor repair work on the building. That contractor's report assessed the building as sound. That directly contradicts the city's assessment. Considerably, Leonard Pruitt said. She retained Patricia Chun and then called her landlord and told him she needed 2 more weeks and would have the full amount. He told her he'd already started proceedings. She told him to pause them. She went to bed at 1:30 in the morning and lay in the dark listening to Maya breathing in the next room and thinking about a room in a basement that had been waiting since 1942. Daniel Voss pulled up at 7:52 in the morning, 8 minutes early. He was shorter than she'd imagined from the text exchange, maybe 70 years old, compact and deliberate in his movements, with close-cropped white hair and hands that moved with the particular economy of someone who'd spent decades handling things that required attention. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru and carried a soft-sided case that would turn out to hold a loupe, a UV light, a moisture meter, 2 pairs of cotton gloves, and 4 reference books whose spines had been repaired with strips of white tape from years of use. He stood at the gate and looked at the hospital for a full minute before saying anything. "I've driven past this building many times," he said finally, knowing it was hiding something and unable to prove it. "You knew about the vault?" Eleanor Harmon contacted me in 1987 when the hospital closed. She said her grandfather had assembled a private collection of European art and manuscripts, and she wanted to discuss how to proceed. He picked up his case. We had 3 telephone conversations over the course of 2 months. Then she stopped calling. What happened? He moved through the gate and up the path alongside her. She was in her 80s by then. The scope of what she was describing, the legal questions around provenance and restitution, the ethical questions about pieces that may have changed hands under duress. It's a weight that's difficult to carry alone. She decided to wait and hope things would clarify themselves. And they didn't. Things very rarely clarify by waiting. In the vault, he moved differently than she had. He had a pattern to it, working each wall methodically from left to right, spending time at each point before moving on. He wrote in a small notebook without looking down, his eyes staying on whatever he was examining. He used the loupe on the labels of the wooden cases for a long time. He pulled the flat drawers open one by one and leaned over each set of documents without removing them. He crouched before the wrapped paintings and examined their edge markings through the protective material. When he finally straightened, almost an hour after they had come down the stairs, he turned to face her. "You understand what you have here?" "I'm beginning to." He turned back to the shelving. "These labels." He gestured to the wooden cases. "I recognize 8 artist names without checking a reference." He moved to the flat drawers and indicated the top document in the nearest open drawer. And Frederick Harmon's Provenance records are in multiple languages, which means some of these pieces came with their own documentation. He was working from records that already existed, cross-referencing them with his own observations. She'd pulled on cotton gloves and been working the flat drawers alongside him, reading each top document before moving to the next. Frederick Harmon's handwriting ran through them, sometimes in English, sometimes in German or French. In several cases, a second handwriting appeared alongside his, a counter-signature, an additional notation. He was documenting the chain of custody as he went, she said, half to herself. Daniel Voss looked over. "Not just documenting." She held up one of the sheets carefully. "This is a purchase agreement from March of 1938. He notes the piece, the seller, the sale price. Then he notes that the sale price was below assessed value and records the seller's stated reason for accepting it. He was building a record of the circumstances." She looked at Frederick's careful handwriting. Against the day when someone would question how he came to have these things. Daniel Voss took the sheet from her and read it. He was quiet for a moment. He knew what was coming, he said. He understood that future generations would ask hard questions about how art moved during those years. He wanted the record to show he'd acted with as much integrity as the circumstances allowed. She thought about the note on the work table. "Please do it honestly. That is all I ask." It was consistent, she said. They worked for another hour. By the time they climbed back up the stairs, she had 3 pages of notes and Daniel Voss had photographed every labeled case and every top document in the flat drawers. The covered object on the work table they left alone. He had looked at it twice, studying the embroidered cloth, the shape beneath it, and both times had turned away. Some things should be understood in order, he'd said. Back in the entrance hall, standing in the gray November light, he took off his gloves. I can begin cross-referencing the documented pieces against the Art Loss Register today. Also the Commission for Looted Art in Europe and 2 other databases. Some of these pieces will appear in those records, meaning families or institutions filed claims years ago. For those, the path forward is clearer, if not simpler. For others, we'll need to dig deeper. How long for a preliminary assessment? 2 weeks. Maybe 3 for something complete. I have 31 days before the demolition. He met her eyes. Then we work quickly. He said it without drama. The same way he'd moved through the vault. With the calm of someone for whom difficulty was a normal condition of work rather than an obstacle to it. She stood in the entrance hall after he drove away and looked at Frederick Harmon's portrait on the wall. The man who'd built this hospital in 1921 and then, 17 years later, built something else beneath it. Something that no city council or development company had ever known to circle. She was locking the front door when she heard a car slow on Archer Road. She turned. A dark gray SUV had pulled to the curb outside the fence, 40 feet from the gate. Tinted windows. A Whitmore Development Group logo she could read from where she stood. The vehicle sat there for 20 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, then pulled away. She stood on the front steps and watched it go. Someone had seen Daniel Voss's car. Someone had been watching this property closely enough to register when it became active again. Gerald Crane had known about the ownership transfer the same day it happened. That kind of speed meant contacts inside the county records system or someone watching for the filing. Either way, this was not a casual interest. This was a campaign, and the demolition order was part of it. A deadline designed to create pressure, to narrow options, to make any outcome except the one Whitmore wanted look unreasonable or costly. She'd seen this logic before, in hospital administration, in the way departments managed outcomes they needed to land in a particular direction. You created conditions that made the other choices look difficult. Then you waited for exhaustion to do the rest. Her phone buzzed. Gerald Crane, a text. My team has noticed increased activity at the property. I would strongly encourage a meeting this week. Time is running out for both of us to benefit from a cooperative arrangement. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at Frederick Harmon's portrait through the glass panel beside the front door. He looked back with the same settled expression he'd had in every photograph she'd seen of him, the look of someone who decided what he believed and arranged his life accordingly. She thought about 31 days. About Patricia Chen filing her motion in the morning. About Daniel Voss beginning his cross-reference work tonight. About the index she'd photographed in the 5th flat drawer, 31 entries in Frederick's careful column, every one of them with a provenance note. She thought about what it meant that none of these people, not Whitmore, not the city, not any of the engineers who'd written up their assessments, knew about the vault below the basement. They were trying to demolish a building because they wanted 3 acres of land. They didn't know that the building was, in a way that had nothing to do with its brick and mortar, the most important structure in Caldwell, Ohio. She locked the gate and walked back to her car. Maya was at the neighbor's house. She picked her up and drove home and made pasta from a box because it was what she had, and they ate together at the kitchen table. Maya told her about a project at school, something involving papier-mâché and a historical figure she'd chosen who turned out to be more complicated than expected. Dara listened and asked questions and ate her pasta and kept most of what was happening inside her on the inside, where it needed to stay until she knew more. After Maya was asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with both letters, her legal pad, and the wooden bird. She read Frederick Harmon's note again from memory. She didn't need to photograph it a second time. It had been in her head since the moment she'd read it in the vault. The clean simplicity of what he'd asked. Not that whoever found the room do something specific with it. Not that they honor his wishes or follow his instructions or pay tribute to his judgment. Just that they do whatever came next honestly. She thought about Gerald Crane's idling SUV and the text about cooperative arrangements. She thought about the structural assessments commissioned by the developer who wanted the land. She thought about Patricia Chen's retainer and the overdraft in her checking account. She picked up her phone and looked at the photographs of the vault, the wrapped paintings, the labeled cases, the index she'd found in the 5th drawer, 31 entries, every provenance note. She thought about what Daniel Voss had said. 8 artist names from the labels alone, without checking a reference. She didn't know enough about the art market to know exactly what that meant. She knew enough to know it meant something. In 1988, 3 independent appraisers had estimated between $200 and $400 million, working from documentation only, without going into the vault. The art market in the years since 1988 had not been static. She looked at the wooden bird on the table and thought about Celestine, 91 years old, placing it on that shelf in the display case sometime before her health failed, making sure the right person would know they'd come to the right place. 31 days. She got out a fresh legal pad page and started listing what needed to happen in the morning. Frederick Harmon had lived in Caldwell, Ohio, and he'd understood what was coming in the world before most people allowed themselves to understand it. He'd done something about it. He'd sealed a room and left a note that asked only for honesty. She had a preservation attorney and a retired appraiser and 2 letters from a dead woman who'd believed in her for years without saying so. She had a set of keys on a faded ribbon and a wooden bird with no dust on it, and a vault full of 82 years of careful, documented, honest waiting. She wrote until midnight. Then she turned off the light and went to bed, already thinking about what came next. Daniel Voss called at 7 the next morning, before Dara had finished her first cup of coffee. He'd been up most of the night. I cross-referenced the labels from my photographs against 4 databases. His voice was steady, but she could hear something underneath it that she hadn't heard the day before. An urgency that had been absent during his careful, methodical work in the vault. I got hits on 6 entries. Confirmed hits, not speculative. 6 out of 31. Yes. He paused. One of them is flagged as a priority claim in the Commission for Looted Art, filed in 1962 by a family in the Netherlands. They've been looking for 62 years. The number landed strangely. 62 years. A family filing a claim the year Dara was born, the same year Maya would one day be born, and they were still looking. What do we do with that? We document everything meticulously before we do anything. Then we contact them. But first I need to see what Frederick left on that table. If his journal is as complete as his index suggests it might be, it will tell us things the labels alone can't tell us. Things about provenance, about the circumstances of each acquisition, that would take me months to reconstruct from external records. He was at the gate by 8. They went directly to the vault. Dara had been thinking about the covered object since she'd first seen it 2 days ago. Daniel Voss had been thinking about it for 30 years, in a way, ever since Eleanor Harmon's phone calls had stopped, and he'd been left with questions that had no answers. He stood at the work table and looked at the embroidered cloth for a moment without touching it. The bird in flight near the corner, dark thread on dark fabric. Then he put on his cotton gloves, and she put on hers, and he lifted the cloth away. Beneath it was a wooden box, roughly the size of a small suitcase, made from a wood she didn't recognize, dark and close-grained with a surface finish that had held through 80 years without cracking. The corners were joined with a precision that spoke of someone who'd built things carefully. A brass clasp on the front, not locked, and carved into the lid, shallow but clear, a bird in flight. The same bird from the cloth, the same bird from the display case upstairs. Frederick Harmon had carved this himself. She was certain of it without being able to say why. Daniel Voss opened the clasp. The lid lifted on hinges that had been maintained, or built to last, because they moved without resistance. Inside the box, 2 things. A bound journal, leather-covered, the spine stitched by hand, the pages thick and cream-colored, the kind of paper bought with the intention of lasting. And beneath the journal, a sealed leather packet, tied with a strip of the same dark ribbon that had held the key ring. On the packet, written in Frederick's handwriting in black ink, for words, for those who sold. Daniel Voss lifted the journal out first and handed it to Dara, because he had understood something without her telling him. This was her family's history, if not by blood then by the chain of trust that had brought her here. She should read it first. She opened to the first page. October 1936. I have made my first acquisition from abroad. A drawing by Levens, acquired through a contact in Amsterdam, who I will not name here for his protection. The family who sold it is named Van den Berg. Father, mother, 3 children. They are trying to get papers to leave the Netherlands. They needed money quickly and were offered a third of what I believe the work is worth by other buyers who understood their desperation. I paid twice what those buyers offered. It was not full value. I do not pretend it was, but it was the best I could do under the circumstances. She read that entry 3 times. He knew. she said. Daniel Voss, who had been making notes while she read, looked up. He knew from the beginning what the circumstances were. He wasn't fooling himself about what he was participating in. He was doing what he could within a situation that didn't offer clean options. She turned the pages carefully. The journal ran from October 1936 to August 1942, entry after entry in Frederick's formal handwriting, each acquisition documented in the same way. Date, piece, seller, circumstances, price paid, and price he estimated the work was worth, and then a section he headed simply notes that contained what he'd learned about each family. Not just the transaction. The people, where they were going after they sold, what they hoped for. A woman named Greta Hoffman in Berlin in 1937, who sold Frederick a small bronze because she needed to pay a bribe to get her son out of a work detail. Frederick noted the son's name. He noted that Greta had told him she'd bought the bronze with her husband in Vienna on their honeymoon in 1922. He noted that she seemed calm when she told him this, calmer than someone telling you about a possession should need to be. A dealer in Paris in 1939, Louis Renard, who sold Frederick 3 paintings on behalf of families he refused to name, only saying they were people who had trusted him with things they could not take with them. Frederick had pressed for more information, and Louis had said, quietly, that knowing the names would only make it harder for Frederick to sleep, which had the effect of ensuring Frederick did not sleep well for several days afterward. An old woman named Margit Verez in Budapest in 1940, selling through a contact, who sent along a handwritten note asking only that whoever ended up with her watercolor would look at it sometimes and understand that she'd made it in a garden she'd loved. There were others. A musician in Prague in 1938 who sold Frederick 3 prints that had hung in a music room that was no longer his. Frederick noted that the man had touched the corner of one print, a gift from a student, and then looked away. A family in Vienna who sold a small bronze through their lawyer because they couldn't bear to be present for the transaction. The lawyer had given Frederick a list of the family members' names and ages, which Frederick had copied into the journal. He noted he wasn't certain why the lawyer had done this, and then he wrote, in the same even hand he used for everything else, that perhaps the lawyer had simply needed someone else to know those names existed. A young woman named Anna Kessler in Paris in 1939, 20 years old, who sold Frederick a drawing she'd inherited from her father. She'd been businesslike through the whole transaction until the moment he picked up the drawing to leave, at which point she'd asked him to wait. She'd looked at it for a moment without touching it, and then said something in German that Frederick had only partly understood, something about her father's hands and how the drawing showed the way he'd held a pen. Frederick had written this out in full and then had written, without further comment, that he'd had difficulty sleeping that night. Dara read that entry twice. Anna Kessler's drawing was on one of those shelves across the room. She didn't know which one, but it was there, and Anna Kessler was certainly gone now, and she might have had children, and the children might have had children, and they might be alive, and they might not know a drawing made by their great-grandfather's hand still existed, had been waiting. She turned back to the journal. Dara stopped at the Margit Verez entry. She sat very still. She looked at the walls of the vault, at the wrapped paintings in their careful rows, and understood that each one of those wrapped packages was not just a piece of art. Each one was a transaction like this. A person in a situation from which there was no good exit, making the best choice available, trusting that the object they'd made or loved or inherited would land somewhere it would be preserved. Frederick Harmon had understood that. He'd written it down so that whoever came after him would understand it too. This changes what we're dealing with, Daniel Voss said quietly. She looked at him. It's not a collection. He gestured at the room. It's a record of people. Every piece in here has a name attached to it that isn't just a provenance record. It's a face, a family, a specific terrible moment in someone's life. That makes the restitution work different, more important, and more complex. She looked at the leather packet on the table. For those who sold. She untied the dark ribbon and opened it. Inside were letters. 31 of them. She would later count, one for each entry in Frederick's index. Some were handwritten, some typed. Some were long, some were 3 sentences. They were in German, Dutch, French, Hungarian, one in Polish that she couldn't read without help. And folded inside each letter, a small photograph. She opened the first one she touched. It was handwritten in German, the date November 1937. Daniel Voss translated as she held it. Dear Dr. Harmon, I want to thank you for your fairness and your discretion. My children are safe now, which is the only thing I wanted. The painting you purchased was my mother's, and her mother's before her. I have thought about whether it was wrong to sell it, and I have decided it was not wrong, because my mother would have wanted her grandchildren to be safe more than she would have wanted her painting on a wall somewhere. I hope you will take good care of it. It was loved. The photograph inside that letter was a family portrait for people standing outside a door that might have been in any city in Central Europe. A man and a woman and 2 children, all of them looking at the camera with the careful composure of people who understood a photograph was a permanent thing. Dara set the letter and photograph down on the work table and pressed her hands flat on the surface. She breathed for a moment. How do we find out if these families survived? Daniel Voss was quiet. Some of them are recorded. Yad Vashem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, genealogical databases. We can cross-reference the names against survivor and casualty records. He paused. Some of these families may have living descendants who don't know this letter or this photograph exists. She looked at the 31 letters. And some of them won't have descendants. He nodded. Yes. She thought about Margit Verez in Budapest in 1940, asking only that someone would look at her watercolors sometimes and understand. She thought about the Van den Berg family in Amsterdam trying to get papers to leave. She thought about Greta Hoffman's son and the bribe his mother had paid. We open all of them, she said. We translate everyone. We add the information to Frederick's index, and we start looking. That's months of work. Then we start today. They spent 4 hours in the vault that afternoon. Daniel Voss photographed every letter. He translated the ones he could and made notes on the ones that would need another translator. Dara cross-referenced each letter against Frederick's journal entries, building a combined record that put the human account alongside the Provenance documentation. She worked with the concentration she'd developed over 4 years of archive work, the ability to be simultaneously careful and fast, to handle fragile material without slowing down. At some point, she became aware that the journal had more pages than she'd read. She'd stopped at the 1940 entry about Margit Verez and hadn't gone further. She went back to it now and turned past that entry. The later entries, from 1941 and 1942, were shorter. The handwriting changed, became less regular. Whatever was happening in Frederick's life in those years, it was affecting his hand. In March 1942, he wrote, I acquired the last piece today. I believe I will not be acquiring any more. The channels I've been using have dried up, which is the charitable interpretation. The other interpretation I won't write here. I am going to seal this room and leave what documentation I can. I hope it will be enough. And then one more entry, the last one, dated September 12, 1942. The same date as the note on the work table. I have written a letter to my wife explaining everything in full. I have told her to tell no one except someone she trusts without question and only when the time is right. I don't know when the time will be right. I don't know what right even means in this particular situation. Some of what I've done here was clearly good. Some of it I'm not sure about. The family sold under duress. I paid better than most would have paid, but that's a low threshold. The pieces are here, and the families are scattered, and I have no way to know which ones survived. I have tried to be honest about all of it. The journal is my record of what I actually did, not what I wish I'd done. Whoever opens this box, please read it as such, not as a justification, as an honest account. The box has a false bottom. The key to the inner compartment is taped to the back of the last journal page. Dara stopped reading. She looked at Daniel Voss. He's been in the journal the whole time. She turned carefully to the last page of the journal. A small brass key was taped to the back of it, the tape yellowed but still holding. She pulled it free and looked at it. Smaller than either of the 2 keys she already had. She pressed on the base of the wooden box and felt a slight give. The false bottom was a thin piece of the same dark wood as the box itself, fitted so precisely she'd never have found it without being told to look. The brass key fit. A tiny lock at one edge. The panel lifted. Inside the hidden compartment, a single folded document and a separate, sealed envelope. Daniel Voss reached for the document first, because he recognized the language even before he'd fully unfolded it. He read it standing at the work table without speaking for several minutes. His expression going through changes she couldn't quite read. What is it? He set it down, smoothed it flat with both hands. It's a bill of sale, dated October 1941. A piece not listed in Frederick's main index. He acquired it through a private contact in Zurich, someone he describes in his journal as operating outside the normal channels, which in 1941 could mean almost anything. She waited. It's a provenance record for a painting. A Vermeer. The word sat between them. Specifically, he continued, a small interior scene, woman with a letter at a table, listed in Dutch sources as having belonged to a private collection in Amsterdam before the war. The Abramovitz collection. Jacob Abramovitz, a banker who died at Westerbork transit camp in 1943. His wife Ruth died in 1944. Their daughter escaped to England in 1941. Daniel Voss looked up from the document. If the daughter had children, there may be living heirs with a direct claim to this painting. Dara looked at the sealed envelope. Also from the hidden compartment. Also in Frederick's handwriting on the front, one line. To the Abramovitz family, whenever they can be found. He wrote them a letter. He kept it in here for 80 years because he never found them. Daniel Voss picked up the envelope carefully. That changes everything about the valuation. A Vermeer, authenticated and with documented provenance, even if complicated provenance, is not in the same category as the rest of the collection. He was quiet for a moment. The 1988 appraisal that Celestine's letter mentioned was between 200 and 400 million. It's possible that estimate was reached without accounting for this piece, since it wasn't in the main index. How possible? He looked at her directly. A small Vermeer interior with this kind of documentation, accounting for the market since 1988, would be valued conservatively at $150 million on its own. She put both hands flat on the work table and stood there. The Vermeer itself was not in the vault. Only its documentation was, which meant either Frederick had kept it elsewhere, or someone had moved it, or it had been lost long before the vault was sealed. Daniel Voss's expression when she said this told her he was already thinking through the same possibilities. We need to look through the building more carefully, he said. Every room, every storage space. They spent the remaining daylight on it. Second floor, third floor, every room they could access. The basement corridors beyond the east wing. A maintenance area near the furnace that she hadn't gone into. A storage room at the back of the ground floor, behind the old pharmacy, that she'd walked past without opening. In the maintenance area, they found nothing relevant. In the pharmacy storage room, they found nothing at first, and then Maya, who had come with Dara that morning because school was closed for a teacher workday and Rosario across the hall was away. Maya, who had been systematically investigating every room with the focused attention she gave to things she'd decided were important, pointed at a section of the back wall and said that the bricks there looked different. They did. Darker mortar. A repair that was newer than the surrounding wall. Daniel Voss examined it. This mortar is perhaps 40 years old, significantly newer than the hospital's original construction. Someone rebuilt this section of wall within the last 40 or 50 years. Someone in Eleanor Harmon's time. He ran his hand along the seam. We'll need a mason to open this without damaging whatever's behind it. We can't do it ourselves without the right tools. Mom. Maya's voice was practical and quiet. We should come back with the right tools. Yes, Dara agreed. We should. She was standing in the back of the pharmacy storage room, looking at a section of wall that had been sealed, and thinking about Eleanor Harmon in the 1980s making a decision she hadn't been able to make earlier, about the Vermeer document in Frederick's hidden compartment, about a woman named Ruth Abramovitz who had died in 1944, about a daughter who had escaped to England. Patricia Chun called at 2 that afternoon. The preservation motion was granted this morning. Judge signed off on a preliminary stay of demolition. The city has 30 days to respond with counter-evidence, or the stay becomes permanent pending a full hearing. Dara sat down in the pharmacy storage room with her back against the wall. 30 more days. That's not the end of it. Whitmore's legal team filed a response within 2 hours of the ruling. They're pushing for an emergency hearing before the city council on the grounds that the structural risk constitutes an imminent public safety hazard. Patricia Chen's voice was brisk and level. They want this building down before the legal process can protect it. Can they do that? They can try. The emergency provision requires evidence of imminent danger to public safety. We have the 2019 structural report from your grandmother's contractor showing the building is sound. They have a newer report commissioned by Whitmore's engineers showing significant risk. The judge will want to see both reports side by side. Who's right? About the building's structural condition? She paused. Buildings this age are complicated. Both assessments may be technically accurate and reaching opposite conclusions based on which measurements they chose to take. and how they framed the risk. That's not reassuring. No, but here's what you should know. The moment the court sees that Whitmore Development paid for the assessment finding the building dangerous and the previous owner paid for the assessment finding it sound, the credibility of Whitmore's report takes a hit. Judges are not naive about how these things work. What do I need to do? Stay in contact. Don't sign anything Crane sends you. Don't agree to any meetings without me present. And let me know if anything changes with the property or the situation. She ended the call. Daniel Voss was standing in the doorway of the storage room. The city council hearing is in 4 days, he said. He'd been on his own calls while she was on hers. I have a contact at the Cleveland Museum of Art, a conservator named Miriam Sato. She can come this week to begin a preliminary assessment of the collection's condition. We need professional documentation of what's in that vault before any hearing. Can she be here in 4 days? She said tomorrow. Miriam Sato arrived the next morning in a rental car with 2 professional cases. She was 55, with graying hair pulled back with functional efficiency and hands that were the same careful hands as Daniel Voss's, people shaped by decades of attention to fragile things. She'd brought her own lighting equipment because she knew better than to rely on whatever power might or might not be functional in an abandoned building. She also, without being asked, brought sandwiches. She and Daniel Voss had worked together before. She knew his habits. They set up work lights in the vault, running off a generator that Dara had rented that morning. The space was transformed by the light. She'd been seeing it by flashlight until now, and flashlight told you objects were there without telling you much about what they were. Proper lighting showed texture and detail and condition, showed the quality of the protective wrappings, showed the labeled cases in a clarity that made their organization even more legible. Miriam Sato went to work on the paintings first. She didn't unwrap them fully. She didn't need to for a preliminary condition assessment. The edges, the wrapping materials, the casings, the environment the vault had maintained. She examined each piece in turn, moving with the same systematic patience as Daniel Voss, making notes on a tablet. After 2 hours, she straightened and looked at Dara. The protective materials are exceptional. Frederick Harmon was buying acid-free paper and archival wrapping materials in the late 1930s, which means he was reading the conservation literature, probably corresponding with museum professionals to understand what was best practice. The environment in this vault has been stable. Temperature, humidity. She looked around at the concrete walls. He understood that a sealed concrete room at this depth would maintain relatively consistent conditions year-round. She paused. These paintings have been better maintained than many works currently in institutional collections. What does that mean for valuation? It means condition won't be a significant downward factor, which is unusual for works of this age that have been in private storage. He made extraordinary decisions. She spent the rest of that day working through the wooden cases and the flat drawers, and she came back the following morning and spent that day too. Dara worked alongside her, and by the end of the second day, she developed a vocabulary she hadn't had before, understanding the difference between a preparatory study and a finished work, knowing what a provenance chain looked like when it had gaps versus when it was complete, beginning to read the labels on the cases in German well enough to recognize artist names. Miriam Sato moved with the systematic patience that came from 2 decades of this work. She photographed everything in proper professional lighting. She documented condition with a precision that produced notes Dara couldn't fully follow, but that Daniel Voss read carefully and nodded over. She brought out objects she identified as especially significant for closer examination, working at the central table in bright light, her hands in cotton gloves, making notes before touching and after touching and between. She found the 2 illuminated manuscripts in the flat drawers on the second day. She lifted the top one out of its drawer and held it in the work light for a long moment. And then she said, quietly and without drama, that she needed to call a colleague in Chicago who specialized in medieval manuscripts, because what she was looking at was significantly older than anything else in the collection. How old? She studied the parchment's edge. 15th century, at the earliest assessment. Possibly earlier. The pigment work in the margin is consistent with Flemish production from that period. She set it down. If this is what I think it is, it changes the character of the collection entirely. Frederick wasn't just collecting 20th century acquisitions. He was acquiring work across 5 centuries. What would it be worth? Miriam Sato looked at her steadily. I need my colleague to confirm before I speculate. She paused. But if I'm right, considerably more than anything else in the room. By the evening of the second day, she had a preliminary inventory that confirmed Daniel Voss's initial identification and extended it. 22 paintings, 7 sculptures, and 3-dimensional works in the wooden cases. 2 illuminated manuscripts, one of them potentially extraordinary. A collection of preparatory drawings, some of them by artists whose finished works were in major museums. And the Vermeer documentation in the hidden compartment, which she examined for a long time before setting it down and saying nothing for a full minute. Finally, she looked at Daniel Voss. If the painting exists and is in the condition this documentation suggests, you're looking at well over $150 million for that piece alone. And the rest? She looked at her notes. The preliminary range for the rest of the documented collection, accounting for condition and current market values, is between $280 million and $340 million. She paused. With the Vermeer, if the painting is found, you're looking at $430 to $450 million, maybe more. The number was larger than the 1988 estimate. Frederick's careful maintenance of the vault had preserved value that inflation alone wouldn't have accounted for. The art market had moved in directions that favored exactly the periods and artists he'd collected. And if the Vermeer isn't found, then you have a collection worth approximately $300 million with clear documentation, which is still one of the most significant private collections in the American Midwest. She held up her tablet, and the Abramovitz letter makes the ethical dimensions of this extremely clear. This collection was never meant to stay here. Frederick said as much in his journal. He was always intending for these things to go back. The city council hearing was the following morning at 9. Dara arrived with Patricia Chun, Daniel Voss, and a folder of documentation that Miriam Sato had prepared, preliminary condition reports and value assessments, carefully written to be readable by people who weren't art professionals. The council chamber was fuller than she'd expected for a 9 o'clock hearing. Gerald Crane sat on one side of the room with 2 attorneys and a city engineer whose name she didn't know. Patricia Chin told her quietly not to look at Crane directly, which was advice she found easy to follow. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Whitmore's team presented their structural assessment with professional confidence, the kind that came from having done this before in other cities with other buildings. The engineer was specific and technically detailed, citing load measurements and foundation analysis and a list of structural concerns that sounded, to a non-expert ear, both serious and irreversible. The man had good delivery. He was clearly used to council chambers and the particular theater of making technical information feel conclusive. Dara sat beside Patricia Chun and listened and made herself pay attention to the detail rather than the performance. She was an archivist. She knew what documentation looked like when it was trying to do work versus when it was trying to create an impression. Patricia Chun presented the 2019 contractor's report and asked the council to note who had commissioned each assessment and when. She took her time with this, letting the council members see the timeline, letting the obvious question form in their minds without asking it out loud. She presented documentation of the property's ownership history, Celestine's 33 years of consistent tax payment, the maintenance work she'd contracted. She noted that the 2019 assessment had found no structural concerns significant enough to warrant demolition, and that this assessment had been commissioned by the property owner rather than by a party with a financial interest in a particular outcome. She paused before the next point. The pause was deliberate, and then she presented, briefly, a statement from Daniel Voss describing the existence of a documented collection of historical artwork in the building's lower level, and noting that the collection had been determined to be of considerable historical importance and that its preservation would require the building itself to remain standing during an evaluation process. The council chamber went very quiet. Gerald Crane's head turned slowly toward where Dara was sitting. She met his eyes for a moment and then looked at the council members instead. One of them, a woman in her 60s on the far right end of the row, had straightened in her chair the way people do when they hear something that changes the nature of the conversation. Another was writing rapidly. A third had his hands flat on the table and was looking at the ceiling. The council chair asked how long the evaluation process would take. Patricia Chun said, conservatively, 90 days. Crane's lead attorney stood and argued that 90 days of delay on a public safety matter was unreasonable. Patricia Chin pointed out that the existence of an unexamined collection of this historical significance might itself constitute a public interest that outweighed the development timeline. The council chair asked both parties to submit written arguments within 5 days and said the stay of demolition would remain in place during the review period. It wasn't a victory. It was a pause. Outside the council building, in the cold November air, Crane appeared beside Dara before she'd reached the sidewalk. He was alone, without his attorneys, which she understood was deliberate. A different kind of conversation than the one inside. "I want you to understand something." His voice was the same controlled register as his phone calls, smooth and measured. "I have been working toward this acquisition for 4 years. I have commitments to investors. I have a timeline." He paused. "Whatever you found in that building, it changes the circumstances, but it doesn't change my position. I'm prepared to increase my offer substantially to account for the collection's value. You could walk away from all of this with enough money to never worry about anything again." Patricia Chin appeared at Dara's shoulder. "Mr. Crane, any further communications should go through my office." He looked at Dara steadily for a moment. "You don't know what you're getting into." She met his gaze. Neither did Frederick Harmon in 1938. He figured it out. Crane left. Patricia Chin watched him go. "He's going to escalate. Probably soon." "I know. Are you prepared for that?" She thought about the 31 letters in the leather packet, about Margaret Verez in her garden and her request that someone look at her watercolors sometimes, about the Van Denberg family trying to get papers to leave Amsterdam, about Ruth Abramovitz who had died in 1944 and the letter in the hidden compartment addressed to her family, sealed and waiting 80 years. "Yes," Dara said. She called Daniel Voss from the parking lot. "The wall in the pharmacy storage room. Can we get a mason there tomorrow?" He said he knew someone. Maya was at school. Dara drove back to the hospital alone and let herself in through the front door and stood in the entrance hall in the quiet and looked at Frederick Harmon's portrait. She thought about Crane's offer. Enough money to never worry about anything again. She thought about what that had looked like from the inside when she'd been sitting in the records basement at St. Benedict's with $180 in her account and a cereal box sole in her daughter's shoe. She thought about what it looked like now. She walked to the portrait and stood closer than she had before. Frederick Harmon had been in his 60s when it was painted, which meant by 1942 he'd been older, in his 70s, sealing a room and writing a last journal entry and taping a key to the back of the last page. A man who'd done something large and complicated and tried to do it honestly and died before he could see how it ended. She hadn't told Crane about the Vermeer documentation. Nobody outside the vault knew about it except her, Daniel Voss, and Miriam Sato. She had thought about that during the hearing, watching Crane's attorneys present their case, understanding that they were arguing over land they believed held a condemned building and nothing else. They had no idea what was under that building. They had no idea that the questions about what to do with what Frederick left were orders of magnitude more complex than any development timeline. If the painting was behind that sealed wall in the pharmacy storage room, everything changed. Not just the monetary figure, which was already larger than she could hold in her head comfortably, but the obligation. The Abramovitz family, a daughter who'd escaped to England in 1941, a letter waiting 80 years. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. An email, not a call. The address was a domain she didn't recognize, ending in NL, the Netherlands. She opened it. "Dear Miss Mack, my name is Elise van Denberg. I am 74 years old and I live in Amsterdam. I hope you will forgive me for contacting you directly. I found your name through a property records search after I read a brief mention in an American legal news database about a preservation dispute involving Harmon County General Hospital in Caldwell, Ohio. My grandmother's name was Clara van Denberg. In 1936, she sold a painting to a physician in the United States, a man she described in her diary as fair and discreet. She wrote his name once, in an entry she crossed out, but I was able to read it. Frederick Harmon. I have been looking for information about my grandmother's painting for 40 years. The painting was a work by Jan Levens, a portrait study, small, approximately 30 centimeters by 40. My grandmother sold it because she needed to get her family out of the Netherlands. Her diary says the physician paid fairly, and she was grateful. My grandmother survived the war. She died in 1989. She never stopped hoping the painting would come back to the family someday. I don't know if you have any information that could help me. I understand if you can't reply. But if there is any connection between the hospital you are trying to preserve and a painting my grandmother sold in 1936, I would very much like to know. Thank you for reading this. Elise Vandenberg. Dara read the email, standing in the entrance hall of the hospital, her phone in both hands. She looked up at the portraits on the wall, at the photograph of the ward room with the nurses moving between the beds, at Frederick Harmon in his white coat. Frederick had written Clara Van Den Berg's name in the first entry in his journal. October 1936. The family who sold it is named Van Den Berg. Father, mother, 3 children. They are trying to get papers to leave the Netherlands. He'd paid double what the other buyers had offered. He'd noted that Clara seemed calm in a way that told him the composure was costing her something. Clara had survived. She'd had a granddaughter. The granddaughter was 74 years old, and she'd spent 40 years looking for a painting that was wrapped in acid-free paper 20 feet beneath where Dara was standing. She pressed her back against the wall and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. 40 years. Elise Van Den Berg had spent 40 years looking. Clara had spent the rest of her life after the war hoping. And the painting had been 20 feet underground in an abandoned hospital in Ohio, wrapped in acid-free paper, maintained in stable conditions, waiting with the patience that objects have when they have no choice but to wait. She opened her eyes. She looked at the 31 letters in the leather packet still spread across the work table below. She thought about the other 29 families they hadn't begun to look for yet. She thought about the Abramovitz daughter who'd gone to England in 1941, who might have had children, who might have grandchildren now, 74 years old herself perhaps, who might have been looking for 40 years of her own. She thought about what Frederick Harmon had written in 1942. Whoever opens this box, please read it as an honest account. She'd read it. She understood it. And she understood what it asked of her, not because he'd spelled it out, but because the account itself made it obvious. The 31 entries in the journal, the 31 letters in the leather packet, the 31 entries in the index. He'd kept them matched, piece to person, documentation to human story, so that whoever came after him couldn't separate the two, couldn't look at the paintings as objects and forget that each one had come from somewhere, from someone, under conditions that were the furthest thing from ordinary. Commerce. He'd made it impossible to see the collection as treasure. She opened her eyes and started writing the reply. Dear Ms. Van Den Berg, my name is Dara Mack, and I am the current owner of Harmon County General Hospital. I want to tell you that your 40 years of looking have not been wasted. Your grandmother Clara sold a Levens painting to Dr. Frederick Harmon in October 1936. He documented the transaction in his personal journal and kept a letter your grandmother wrote to him. The painting is in the hospital's lower level, where it has been stored in careful conditions since 1936. Please call me at your earliest convenience at the number below. I believe you should come to Caldwell. She read it through once. She changed one word, earliest to soonest, because soonest felt less formal, and the letter she'd just written was not a formal letter. It was a letter to a 74-year-old woman who had spent 40 years. She sent it. Then she locked up the hospital and drove to pick up Maya from school, and sat in the pickup line with both hands on the wheel and thought about nothing in particular for 8 minutes, which was what she did sometimes when the alternative was thinking about too many things at once. Maya climbed in and looked at her mother's face with the assessment that had become a reflex between them. Good day or hard day? Both, Dara said. The good kind of both. Her phone rang at 8 that evening. The Netherlands code she now recognized. Elise Van Den Berg's voice was older than she'd expected from the formal email, warmer, the English slightly accented in a way that made every word precise. I read your message 4 times. She stopped. I had to sit down. I understand. She wrote to him. My grandmother wrote to him. I didn't know that. I knew she'd sold it, but I didn't know she'd written to the buyer. What did she say? That your family was safe. She said that was the only thing she wanted from the sale, and that she got it. Dara paused. She called him fair and discreet. A long silence. She was not a sentimental woman, my grandmother. She would not have said that easily. Elise Van Den Berg's voice had changed, something compressed in it. Did he keep the letter well? It's in a sealed leather packet with the others. It's been in the vault the whole time. Dara kept her voice even. The paper is in good condition. Her handwriting is very clear. Another long silence. I would like to come to Ohio. As soon as it can be arranged. I'm 74, and I've been waiting 40 years, and I would like to not wait any longer. Come as soon as you can, Dara said. The painting is here. After the call, she sat at the kitchen table and looked at the photographs she'd taken in the vault, cycling through them on her phone. The wrapped paintings in their careful rows, the labeled cases, the flat drawers of documents, the wooden box on the work table, open now, its hidden compartment revealed. Maya appeared in the doorway in pajamas. "You're doing the staring at the phone thing. I got an email from a woman in Amsterdam. She's been looking for her grandmother's painting for 40 years. It's in the vault." Maya sat down across from her. "Is she coming to get it?" "She's coming to see it. What happens after that is more complicated. It's her family's painting. It was always her family's painting. But there are legal processes. Her daughter absorbed this. It's like a lost dog." Dara looked up. "What? If someone finds your lost dog, they don't just keep it. You do paperwork, but eventually the dog goes home. Because it's your dog." Something in Dara's chest settled. "Yes, something like that." Maya went back to bed. Dara stayed at the table. She pulled out the photographs of Frederick's journal entries and looked at them again, the later ones, the ones from 1941 and 1942 when the handwriting had changed. He'd known he was running out of time. Not just because the acquisition channels were closing, but because he was 73 years old in 1942 and he understood the math of that as clearly as he understood anything. He'd built a room and filled it and documented every piece and hidden a compartment inside his documentation and written a letter he couldn't deliver to a family he couldn't find. And then he'd sealed it all and told his wife and died the following year. He'd built something that could wait. She put her phone down and looked at the ceiling. Tomorrow the mason was coming for the pharmacy wall. Tomorrow they might find out whether the Vermeer still existed or whether it had been lost somewhere in the 82 years between Frederick sealing the room and Dara opening it. Tomorrow Elise van den Berg would be booking a flight to Ohio. Tomorrow the city council would be reading Patricia Chen's written submission and Whitmore Development's counter-submission, and a judge somewhere would be weighing structural assessments against historical significance and making decisions that would determine whether the building still stood in 31 days. She sat at the kitchen table in her apartment with $180 left in her account and an eviction notice that was being held in abeyance by a landlord who'd agreed to wait, and she tried to hold all of it at once. She couldn't. Nobody could. What she could do was what she'd done every day for 4 years in the records basement at St. Benedict's. One file at a time, one document at a time, one story at a time, handled with care, logged accurately, preserved correctly. She picked up her pen and started making the next day's list. The mason Daniel Voss had called was a man named Roy, maybe 60 years old, with the evaluating eye of someone who'd spent decades reading walls. He spent 10 minutes in the pharmacy storage room before touching anything, crouching, pressing, tapping, moving along the length of the newer section with his knuckles, and then with a small rubber mallet he'd produced from his bag. He straightened. "Someone built a cavity back here." His voice was matter of fact. 3-4 inches deep behind the brick face, maybe more. "See how the mortar line at the top is slightly higher on this section? Whoever did it was good, knew what they were doing. But they were working fast, I'd guess, and they couldn't quite match the original line." "Eleanor Harmon," Daniel Voss said. "Probably in the mid-1980s, before the hospital closed." Roy looked at him. "Want me to open it?" "Carefully," Dara said. He worked with the precision his decades warranted, removing bricks one by one from the top of the section, setting each one on the floor in the order he'd removed it. The first 4 came out clean. The 5th revealed the edge of a space behind. He redirected his light. "There's something in there." He stepped back. "You should look." Dara moved forward. Her flashlight found the interior of the cavity. Inside, wrapped in what looked like painter's canvas and strapped with buckled leather bands, stood a rectangular object roughly 2 feet by 2.5 feet. The wrapping was old but intact. The leather straps were darkened with age, but the buckles held. On the canvas, written in marker that had faded to near invisibility, one word in what she recognized as Eleanor Harmon's generation's handwriting. "Safe." She looked at Daniel Voss. He was looking at the same word. "Eleanor hid it," Dara said. "She hid it separately from the vault. She didn't trust the vault to be enough. She trusted this wall more than she trusted any lock," he said quietly. "She sealed it in brick, built it into the building itself." Roy looked at both of them. "You want it out of there?" "Not yet." Dara stepped back. She took photographs, many photographs, from multiple angles. The cavity, the wrapped object, the word safe on the canvas, the brick that had concealed it. Then she looked at the wrapped painting that might be a Vermeer, that might be the key to the Abramovitz family, that might be worth $150 million, that had been sitting in a bricked-up wall in an abandoned hospital in Ohio for 40 years because an old woman had trusted solid masonry more than she'd trusted herself to make the right decision. She thought about Gerald Crane's offer. Enough money to never worry about anything again. She thought about Elise Van Den Berg booking a flight. About Ruth Abramovitz and the sealed letter. She thought about Frederick Harmon in 1942 taping a key to the back of the last page of his journal. She thought about what came next. The Vermeer was still wrapped in its canvas. Roy stood behind her with his mallet, patient, waiting for direction. Daniel Voss stood at the edge of the cavity with his hands at his sides. Nobody moved. The pharmacy storage room was quiet except for the sound of the building settling. Deep structural sounds that had been here for 103 years, and, if she had anything to say about it, would be here for 103 more. She took one more photograph. Then she looked at Roy and nodded, and he began carefully widening the opening. Roy worked for 40 minutes, removing bricks with the care of a man who understood that whatever was behind them was worth more than speed. Daniel Voss stood to the left. Dara stood to the right. Neither of them spoke. Maya sat on an overturned supply crate near the door, watching in the focused silence she brought to things she'd decided were important. When the opening was wide enough, Roy stepped back and looked at Dara. "Your call." She put on her cotton gloves. She reached into the cavity and found the edges of the canvas wrapping and pulled, gently, steadily, until the object slid forward and she could take the weight of it with both hands. It was not heavy. Something about that surprised her, that something potentially worth $150 million should weigh no more than a framed mirror. She set it on the floor of the storage room and crouched beside it. The leather straps came free when she unbuckled them, the metal dry but functional. The canvas wrapping had been layered, 3 separate sheets, each one carefully overlapped. She peeled the first back, the second, the third. Underneath was a wooden panel, not canvas, a small rectangular piece mounted on a thin cradle that someone had built specifically for this piece. The paint surface faced inward, protected. She turned it over. Miriam Sato had arrived 20 minutes earlier, called by Daniel Voss the previous evening. She was standing just behind Dara's shoulder. When the painting came into view, she leaned forward, and her sharp intake of breath was the loudest sound in the room. The image was small, the size of a sheet of notebook paper. A woman seated at a table near a window, her face turned slightly away from the viewer, light falling across her from the left in the way that Vermeer had turned into something almost beyond technical description, not just illumination but presence, the sense of witnessing a moment that existed before the viewer arrived and would continue after. The woman held nothing. She was simply there, in the light, in her own interior stillness. Miriam Sato put on her gloves and took the panel from Dara's hands with the reverence of someone handling a newborn. She tilted it toward the work light Roy had brought. She examined the edges, the back of the panel, the craquelure pattern in the paint surface, the ground layer visible at a small area of damage near the lower left corner. She used her loupe. She was quiet for 4 minutes. Then she looked up. "This is real." The words sat in the pharmacy storage room for a moment before anyone responded. Daniel Voss said, quietly, that he'd needed to hear her say it. "It's real," Miriam Sato said again, as if saying it twice made it land more firmly in the world where things were true. "It's in extraordinary condition, which is consistent with the storage environment in the vault, panel paintings of this period being more stable than canvas in controlled humidity. The Provenance documentation from the hidden compartment is the most complete I've seen for a piece of this age in private hands. If anything, the market estimate I gave you yesterday was conservative." She looked at Dara. "You understand what you have." "I'm beginning to," Dara said. It was the same answer she'd given Daniel Voss 4 days ago in the vault. It still felt true. The news that Gerald Crane received that afternoon, from whatever source he had inside the city's legal system, was not the news he'd been waiting for. Patricia Chun called Dara to say that Whitmore Development had filed an emergency appeal with the state court, arguing that the newly discovered collection created a public safety liability rather than a preservation interest, on the grounds that public attention to the building would draw visitors to a structurally compromised site. The argument was creative. It was also, Patricia Chun said with a dry brevity that conveyed her professional opinion clearly, not going to work. Why not? Because the same week they filed that argument, Miriam Sato submitted her preliminary condition assessment of the collection to the court, including her professional determination that the building's lower level had maintained stable environmental conditions across 82 years, which is not consistent with a structure in imminent structural danger. Patricia paused. Their own argument undermines their evidence. You can't have a building that's about to fall down and also a vault that's been maintaining museum-quality preservation conditions for 80 years. The physics don't support both claims simultaneously. Crane also tried something else, which Patricia Chun discovered through a colleague. He'd reached out to Miriam Sato's institution with a proposal. The specifics were vague enough to be deniable, but the suggestion was that a revised assessment, one that found the collection less historically significant, would be met with generous support for the institution's upcoming capital campaign. Miriam Sato's response, relayed to Dara through Daniel Voss, was 2 words that she asked not be repeated in professional correspondence. She contacted Dara directly after that. "I've been doing this work for 23 years, she said. "I have never once adjusted a professional assessment to suit a donor or a developer." She paused. "And I certainly won't start for a man who paid engineers to find structural failures that convenient timing suggests they were looking for." Her written assessment stood as filed. She added a note to it acknowledging that an approach had been made and that her evaluation had been conducted without reference to any financial considerations from any interested party. The state court denied the emergency appeal 2 days later. The demolition stay became permanent pending a full historic preservation hearing. Gerald Crane's investors began making calls. Patricia Chun tracked this through public financial filings. 3 of Whitmore Development's primary backers formally withdrawing from the Caldwell project within a week of the court ruling. Without their capital commitments, the development proposal was functionally dead. The land Crane had spent 4 years trying to acquire was no longer economically accessible. He did not contact Dara again. Elise van den Berg arrived on a Thursday. She was smaller than Dara had imagined, with white hair and the deliberate movements of someone who'd learned to be careful with a body that had been reliable for 74 years and might not always be. She came through the airport terminal pulling a single rolling bag, and she stopped when she saw Dara holding a handwritten sign with her name, and she looked at the sign for a moment before she looked at the woman holding it. "You found everything," she said. Her English was precise and warm. Dara had told her, in their calls and emails, what the vault contained and what Frederick's journal said about the Van den Berg family. She had not told her one specific detail. She'd been saving it. "Your grandmother wrote him a letter," Dara said. "It's been in a sealed leather packet in the vault since 1936. He kept it with letters from everyone who sold to him." Elise van den Berg was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the airport floor. "She never told me she'd written to him." "She did. She told him your family was safe. She said that was the only thing she'd wanted from the sale, and she got it." Elise van den Berg nodded, a small controlled nod, the movement of someone receiving information they'd been waiting for long enough that the waiting had become part of them. Then she looked up. "I would like to see the painting." They drove to the hospital the next morning, a gray December day with light snow in the air. Maya came because she had decided this was a day she needed to be present for, and she was right. Elise van den Berg sat in the back seat beside Maya, and they talked, the old woman asking Maya about school and Maya answering directly, the way she answered things, without performance. Elise asked what Maya's favorite subject was. Maya said history. Elise said that was a good choice. She said that history was the only subject that told you what people had actually done rather than what they said they would do. Maya thought about this for the rest of the drive. Inside the hospital, Elise stopped at Frederick Harmon's portrait in the entrance hall. She studied it for a long time. "My grandmother described him as careful," she said finally. In her diary, she wrote that he had the face of someone who thought before speaking. "He wrote everything down," Dara said. "He was afraid nothing would be remembered correctly otherwise." Elise nodded. "Yes, that is the kind of person who thinks before speaking." She asked to see the rest of the building before the vault. She wanted to understand where she was, she said, what the building had been. They walked the same path Dara had walked on her first visit. The entrance hall, the staircase, the patient rooms on the second floor with their empty bed frames, the operating theater on the third floor, which Elise examined with the attention she'd given to everything, standing in the gallery tier and looking down at the circular operating floor and saying something quiet in Dutch that she didn't translate. "What was that?" Maya asked. Something my grandmother said once, Elise said, about how the places where people go in their worst moments should be kept with respect. She looked around the theater. This building kept people alive for 66 years. That's not nothing. Dara thought about the patient rooms, about the people who'd lain in those beds and looked out those windows. No, she said. It's not. In the vault, Miriam Sato had arranged the Van den Berg piece separately from the others, set up on a small easel in the work light, unwrapped, displayed as it had been meant to be displayed. The painting was small, a portrait study, the face of a young man looking slightly off to the left, the paint handling confident and specific, every part of the face given the same quality of attention. Elise van den Berg stopped 4 feet from it and didn't move closer for a full minute. Maya stood beside Dara and didn't say anything. She understood, without being told, that this was a moment that required stillness. When Elise finally moved forward, it was slowly, and she stopped again when she was close enough to see the detail in the eyes of the painted face. My grandmother bought this when she was 32 years old, she said. She saved for 2 years to buy it at an auction in Amsterdam. She loved it because she said the young man in the portrait looked like her brother, who had died when he was 20. He paused. Then she sold it to keep her children alive. And the children lived. She looked at Dara. And I am here. And the painting is here. She paused again, a long pause. Both things survived. Dara had the leather packet. She'd brought it from the vault, and she held it out now, Clara's letter inside. Elise took it carefully. She didn't open it right away. She held it, feeling the weight of it, the thickness of the paper inside. She wrote it 88 years ago, Elise said. She did. And he kept it. He kept all of them. Every letter from every person who sold to him. He kept them in a sealed packet that he called for those who sold. Elise van den Berg opened the letter then, standing in the vault of Harmon County General Hospital in Caldwell, Ohio, and read her grandmother's handwriting for the first time. She read it once, slowly. Then she folded it and held it against her chest. My children are safe, she said quietly. That's what she wrote. Yes. Elise looked up at the ceiling for a moment, the way people do when they're trying not to cry in front of strangers. Then she looked at Dara. She never stopped hoping it would come back. But she knew it might not. She told me once that the painting had done its job. That was the word she used. Job. She said, the painting did its job, and so we did ours. He paused. I didn't understand what she meant until now. Maya's hand found Dara's and held it. The question of what would happen to the Levens painting was not complicated. Elise van den Berg was Clara's granddaughter. The documentation was complete, and the legal path to restitution was, as Patricia Chun confirmed, unusually clear. The painting would be returned to Elise formally, with documentation establishing the full chain of ownership and the circumstances of the 1936 sale. What Elise intended to do with it, she said she hadn't decided yet. Perhaps loan it to a museum in Amsterdam, so people could see it. Perhaps keep it in her house for a while. Perhaps both, in time. I've waited 40 years, she said. I think I'm allowed to take a few weeks to decide. Dara told her about the Abramovitz Vermeer. Elise listened. She was quiet for a moment. You don't know if the family can be found? Daniel Voss has been looking since we found the documentation. The daughter who went to England in 1941 was named Sarah. He's tracing her through British immigration records and naturalization documents. He hasn't found her yet, but he's found evidence she survived the war. He paused. If Sarah had children, and he believes she did, there may be grandchildren. Elise looked at the Vermeer on its easel, where Miriam Sato had placed it beside the Levens for documentation purposes. 2 small paintings, different in style and subject, but similar in the quality of their presence, the sense each gave of something captured at a specific moment in time. Frederick wrote a letter to the Abramovitz family, Dara said. He sealed it in the hidden compartment with the documentation. He was waiting to deliver it until he found them, and he died before he did. Elise van den Berg looked at the sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front, faded after 80 years, but still legible. To the Abramovitz family, whenever they can be found. He wrote it knowing he might never be able to deliver it, she said. Yes. She looked at Dara steadily. Then you deliver it. That's what you're here for. The historic preservation application was submitted to the National Register of Historic Places on a Monday afternoon in December. Patricia Chun had been building the documentation for weeks, pulling together every record that established the hospital's historical significance, its operational history, its architectural merit, its role in the community, and now, in addition to all of that, its connection to a documented collection of wartime art acquisition that had become, in the words of Daniel Voss's formal statement, one of the most complete private records of individual cultural preservation efforts during the Second World War currently known to exist. The application ran to 200 pages. Patricia Chun submitted it with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for the right document to build and had finally found it. The preliminary assessment from the National Register came back in 10 days. The building met the criteria for listing under 3 separate categories. The formal listing would follow the standard review period, but the preliminary determination was enough to trigger additional federal protections that made any further demolition effort legally untenable. Gerald Crane's project was finished. The formal appraisal, conducted by a team that Miriam Sato assembled and supervised, took 3 weeks. They worked from the collection's documentation, from Frederick's journal, from their own physical examination of each piece. They cross-referenced with the Art Loss Register, with auction records, with the current market for comparable works in each category. Dara sat in on parts of the appraisal sessions, not to influence them, but because the process taught her things she needed to know. She understood the documentation side of the collection. The appraisal team taught her the other side, the market side, the way value was constructed and argued and defended and sometimes disputed. She asked questions, and the appraisers answered them with the patience of professionals who'd encountered many kinds of people in these situations and appreciated being asked questions instead of being told things. The illuminated manuscript from the flat drawers, confirmed by Miriam's colleague from Chicago as a 15th-century Flemish devotional book, had come in well above the initial range. The colleague from Chicago had spent 2 days in the vault and left with the expression of someone who'd been given an unexpected gift by a world that usually distributed such gifts stingily. He said the manuscript was among the 10 most complete examples of its type he'd examined in his career. He said he'd be writing about it for the rest of his professional life. Several of the preparatory drawings had been identified as being by artists whose finished works were in major museums. The market for drawings had changed substantially since 1988, partly because several high-profile sales had reset expectations about what preparatory work could command. And the Vermeer, which Frederick had protected separately, which Eleanor had hidden behind a brick wall in the pharmacy storage room, which had been waiting 82 years in its painter's canvas wrapping, came in at $165 million. The final figure was $435 million. Miriam Sato presented it to Dara in a document that ran to 40 pages of precise, exhaustive reasoning. She said that she stood by every number and that she had signed every page personally. Dara looked at the total on the last page for a long moment. Then she looked at Miriam Sato. What would Frederick think of that number? Miriam considered this seriously, the way she considered things. She said that Frederick had been a careful man, and that careful men rarely set out to accumulate. They set out to do something specific. What he'd accumulated was a consequence of what he'd done, not the objective of it. She paused. He'd probably be glad about the Provenance documentation holding up. That was the thing he seemed most worried about. Not the value. Whether the record would be legible 80 years later. It was, Dara said. Yes, Miriam agreed. It was. Daniel Voss found Sarah Abramovitz 3 weeks after the appraisal was completed. He found her through a combination of British immigration records, a naturalization application filed in 1943, a marriage record from 1951 under the name Sarah Abramovitz Whitfield, and an obituary in a Manchester newspaper from 2003. Sarah had died at 83. She had been a schoolteacher. She had 2 children, a daughter named Ruth, named for her own mother, and a son named Jacob, named for her father. Ruth Abramovitz Whitfield lived in Edinburgh. Jacob Abramovitz Whitfield lived in Montreal. Between them, they had 5 children, all adults now. Sarah's grandchildren. Daniel Voss contacted them through a carefully written letter that explained the situation without making promises he couldn't keep. He said there was reason to believe a painting that had belonged to their great-great-grandparents had been preserved by a private collector in Ohio and might be available for restitution, and that there was also a letter, written in 1942 by the man who had protected the painting, addressed to the Abramovitz family. Ruth called Dara 2 days later. Her voice was careful, the voice of someone who had heard things like this before and been disappointed. He kept a letter for us? Since 1942. He sealed it in a hidden compartment. He wrote it hoping to find your family and deliver it himself. Why didn't he? He died in 1943. He never found you. A long pause. My grandmother Sarah, Ruth said slowly. She always knew the painting was gone. She said her parents had sold it before she escaped, and she never knew what happened to it after that. She said she'd made her peace with not knowing. But she kept a photograph of it. She had it in her room until she died. He paused. I have the photograph now, in a frame on my desk. Dara looked at Frederick's letter in its sealed envelope on the table in front of her. To the Abramovitz family, whenever they can be found. She said, when can you come to Ohio? Ruth came with her brother Jacob. They flew separately and arrived on the same day. Two people in their 50s who had the same careful eyes and the same way of moving through the hospital's entrance hall, slowly, taking everything in. Dara gave them Frederick's letter before she showed them the painting. She put it in Ruth's hands in the entrance hall, under Frederick Harmon's portrait. She told them what it was, that it had been sealed in 1942, that Frederick had never been able to deliver it. Ruth held the envelope for a long moment. She showed it to Jacob. They looked at the handwriting together. Then Ruth broke the seal. The letter was written in English, which was not Frederick's first language. The syntax slightly formal. The sentences constructed with the care of someone writing in his second tongue because he didn't know what language the reader would be able to read. Dear family of Jacob and Ruth Abramovitz, I acquired a painting from your collection in October 1941. I did not acquire it directly from your family. It came through a contact in Zurich whose methods I did not examine as carefully as I should have. I have since researched the painting's history, and I believe it was part of your family's collection in Amsterdam before the war. I do not know if you survived. I have tried to find you and have not been able to. If you are reading this, you survived. I am glad. I am sorry I could not find you sooner. The painting is safe. It has been kept with care. Please take it home. With respect and sorrow for what was done to your family, Frederick James Harmon, Caldwell, Ohio, March 1942. Ruth held the letter in both hands and did not speak for a while. Jacob looked at the portrait of Frederick Harmon on the wall. He stood looking at it for a long time. He tried to find us, Jacob said finally. He tried for a year, Dara said. He kept the letter because he didn't want to give up on delivering it. Jacob looked at the portrait for another moment. Then he nodded, a slow nod that contained something she couldn't name, something that was acknowledgement and grief, and something quieter than either of those things. They saw the Vermeer in the vault. Ruth stood before it for a long time. She said that the photograph on her desk at home showed a woman with a letter at a window, which her mother Sarah had told her was painted in Amsterdam in the 17th century, which her grandmother Ruth, the one the painting was named for, had kept in her bedroom because she loved the quality of the light in it. The quality of the light in it was exactly what Miriam Sato had described, the thing that made it unmistakably a Vermeer. Ruth took a photograph of it with her phone. She said it was for her desk, to put beside the old one. The restitution process took 14 months. That was not slow, for work of this complexity. Daniel Voss coordinated with the Art Loss Register and the Commission for Looted Art and legal teams in 4 countries. 15 of the 31 pieces were returned to living descendants. 6 went to museums that could document institutional claims, for had no traceable heirs and were sold at auction with proceeds going to an endowment. The illuminated manuscript, after extended consultation with the Italian government and the Vatican Library, was donated to a museum in Florence. The Vermeer was returned to Ruth and Jacob Abramovitz Whitfield, who loaned it immediately to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam on a long-term loan, where it hung beside other works from the period, in a room where anyone could see it. Not every return was simple. Anna Kessler's drawing, the one Frederick had bought from a 20-year-old woman in Paris who'd touched the frame at the last moment and said something about her father's hands, had 3 potential heirs, 2 cousins from different branches of the family who disagreed about who had the stronger claim. Daniel Voss spent 2 months mediating between their respective attorneys before a solution was found. The drawing would rotate between both families on a 5-year schedule, spending time with each, a schedule that would run until the next generation decided differently. The 3 prints from the musician in Prague had a more straightforward resolution. The musician's grandson, a retired professor in Brno who had known the prints only from a single photograph in his father's album, came to Caldwell to collect them. He was 70 years old, and he had never expected to see them. He sat with them in the conference room they'd set up in the hospital's old administrative suite, looking at each one in turn, and he said that the photograph in his father's album had always been slightly out of focus, and he'd spent his whole life wondering if the prints were as beautiful as they looked blurred, and now he knew. Margaret Verez had no surviving descendants. Her watercolor, the one she'd made in a garden she'd loved and asked only that whoever had it would look at it sometimes, went to a museum in Budapest that had a collection from the period. The acquisition curator wrote Dara a letter saying they would hang it in the permanent collection and that the wall label would include Margaret's request, so that every visitor who stood before it would know what she'd asked. Dara kept a copy of that letter in her office. The musician's grandson sent a postcard from Brno after he got home. On the back he'd written, "My grandfather would be surprised that Ohio kept his prints so well. I'm not surprised at all. He seems like he was a careful man." She kept that too. The Leavens portrait went home with Elise van den Berg on her return flight to Amsterdam. She had it reframed by a conservator she trusted and hung it in her living room, in the light from the west-facing window, which she said was the right light for it. She sent Dara a photograph the week it went up. Dara put the photograph on the wall in the office she'd set up in what had been the hospital's administrative suite on the second floor, beside the photographs of several other families, beside a map of the cities the pieces had come from and the cities they'd returned to. The building did not become something else. It remained itself, which was what it had always been best at. The Frederick Harmon Center for Historical Preservation and Research opened in the following spring. The vault was part of the public exhibition, accessible by guided tour, the contents displayed as Frederick had organized them, with his journal entries paired with the letters from the cellars and the documentation of where each piece had gone. The operating theater on the third floor had been restored and was used for lectures. The administrative spaces on the second floor housed a small research team dedicated to art, restitution work, working with families and institutions across 3 continents. The opening drew more people than Dara had expected, and she'd expected a fair number. The news about the collection had spread through art history circles and restitution organizations and local media in ways she'd neither controlled nor entirely anticipated. The story, as people outside the situation tended to tell it, was about the money. The $435 million. The condemned building that turned out to be sitting on a collection worth more than the entire city budget. Dara didn't correct that version, but the version she kept telling to anyone who asked her directly was about the journal. About a physician in Caldwell, Ohio, who'd understood what was coming and done what he could, and who'd been careful enough to write down not just what he'd acquired, but who he'd acquired it from, and under what circumstances, and why, and what he'd hoped for. That was the story. The money was just the consequence of the story. The local newspaper ran a front-page feature the week before the opening. Dara gave the interview in the entrance hall under Frederick Harmon's portrait. The reporter was young and earnest and asked whether Dara felt that the city had been wrong to pursue demolition. She said that the city had acted on the information it had, and that what mattered now was what was built with what had been found. The reporter asked whether she felt vindicated after the struggle to save the building. She said she wasn't sure vindication was the right word. She said that the building had always been worth preserving. It had just needed someone to say so loudly enough, and with enough documentation that the people making decisions could hear it. The city council, including the 2 members who had voted against the stay of demolition, attended the opening. The council chair said something in her remarks about the responsibility a community had toward its own history, which Dara appreciated without entirely believing. She understood that people said things at openings that represented where they hoped to be rather than where they were. That was fine. Aspiration was how people moved. Gerald Crane was not there. His investors had pulled out, his project was dead, and he had moved on to other cities with other parcels of land where the history was less complicated. Dara had heard, through Patricia Chun, that Whitmore Development was pursuing a waterfront development in a different Ohio city. She had no particular feelings about this except that she hoped whoever owned that waterfront's history knew what they had. Patricia Chun was there. Daniel Voss was there. Miriam Sato came from Cleveland. Elise van den Berg flew back from Amsterdam. Ruth and Jacob Abramovitz Whitfield came from Edinburgh and Montreal and brought, between them, 3 of their children. A woman from the Commission for Looted Art came from London and spent 2 hours in the exhibit before the opening ceremony and an hour and a half afterward. She spoke with Daniel Voss for a long time in the corner of the entrance hall, and whatever they were discussing, It had the quality of two people making plans that would extend well beyond the day. Dara caught the phrase several other collections and understood that what Frederick Harmon had done in Caldwell was not singular. There were other rooms in other cities. Other people who'd preserved things and died before they could resolve what they'd preserved. The work she was in the middle of was not a single story. It was one thread in something much larger. Roy the Mason came. He stood in the entrance hall in a good shirt looking slightly uncomfortable. The way people look in spaces they've worked in when the work is done and the space has become something else. Dara found him looking at the photograph of the ward room on the wall, the nurses in their white caps moving between the beds. "I used to come here," he said, "when I was young. My aunt worked on the 3rd floor. He looked at the photograph. "It looks the same." "I'm glad," Dara said. He nodded and went to get something from the refreshment table and didn't say anything else, which was the right thing. Daniel Voss gave a brief address at the opening. He was not naturally a speaker, but he was honest, which was better. He talked about what Frederick Harmon had built and why, and he talked about the families whose pieces had come home, and he said that the work was not finished, that the 4 pieces sold at auction were not failures, but were the result of doing the best possible with incomplete information, and that the endowment those sales created would fund the search for information that might make future decisions less incomplete. He looked at Dara when he said that last part. She looked back. Maya wore a dress she'd chosen herself, dark blue, and gave a small tour of the vault exhibition to Jacob's youngest, a 15-year-old named Frederick, named for no particular reason his parents could remember, which Jacob said made Dara laugh in a way he found gratifying. Dara paid her back rent in full in January. The landlord accepted the bank transfer without comment, which was its own kind of communication. She found a house to rent near the hospital, 3 bedrooms, a yard, a kitchen large enough that 2 people cooking in it didn't require negotiation. Maya chose the room with the window that faced east because she liked to see the sky in the morning. She sent the field trip envelope to school in Maya's backpack on a Monday morning. Maya noticed because her mother had mentioned the field trip 2 weeks ago without sending the envelope, and Maya had not said anything about it. "Are you mad I forgot before?" Dara asked. "No." Maya considered. "You were busy saving a building." "That's true, but I still should have sent it." Maya shrugged, the 8-year-old's version of absolution. "You sent it now." The things that changed were mostly small and specific. She stopped checking her bank account twice in the morning before she'd had coffee. She stopped doing the particular calculation she'd been doing for 4 years, the one where you added up what you had and subtracted what you owed and tried to find a version where the number came out positive. She stopped buying the cheaper version of things when the better version was only marginally more expensive and would last longer, which was the kind of decision poverty makes you make so many times that you stop noticing you're making it. She bought Maya new shoes, real ones, with proper soles. Maya wore them to school and came home to report that Tyler in her class had complimented them, which she said she considered irrelevant but mentioned anyway. Dara took the center director's position, which came with a salary that was not enormous but was stable and came with health insurance and the kind of work she could see the point of every day. The offer had come from a board that Daniel Voss had helped assemble, people from the museum world and the restitution advocacy community who understood what the center was trying to do and wanted it done correctly. She gave notice at St. Benedict's on a Friday afternoon. Gerald in the records department accepted it with the combination of mild disappointment and total unsurprise that she'd expected from him. He wished her well. He did not suggest she would be easy to replace. She cleaned out her desk in the records basement. She turned off the fluorescent lights, which flickered once, held, and steadied, as they always did at 3:45 in the afternoon. She drove to the hospital and let herself in through the front door and walked the whole building one more time, just for herself, in the quiet of a late January afternoon. She went up to the operating theater and stood in the gallery tier. She went to the ward room on the 2nd floor and looked out the window at Archer Road and the fence that was no longer there, removed when the city accepted the preservation designation and acknowledged the building as what it had always been. She went down to the vault and stood in the center of it for a few minutes. Then she climbed back up and stood in the entrance hall under Frederick Harmon's portrait, and she said, out loud, to no one in particular, that she was going to try to do it honestly. She had a feeling he'd have found that an adequate beginning. Then she went upstairs to her office and started the day's work. Maya, told she could ask for whatever she wanted for her 9th birthday, asked for woodworking lessons. She said she'd been thinking about it for a while. She wanted to learn how to build things that lasted. Dara enrolled her in a class taught by a retired carpenter named Jim who held sessions in his garage workshop on Saturday mornings. There were 4 other students, all adults, which Maya accepted without comment and navigated with the same directness she brought to most situations. She was the youngest person in the room, and she was not the worst, which Jim told Dara privately was unusual for a first-day student. The first project was a small box. Simple joinery, a lid that fit properly, the kind of project that taught the fundamental relationship between measurement and result. Maya worked on it for 3 Saturdays and brought it home on the 4th in her arms, holding it with a care that was not precious but specific, the care of someone who understood what the object had cost to make. She set it on the kitchen table. Dara turned it over in her hands. The corners were tight, the lid seated evenly. The surface had been sanded with the grain and then oiled until the wood showed what it was. "It's good," she said. Maya looked at the box critically, the way she looked at things she was still thinking about. "I could have sanded the inside better. Jim showed me after class. The corners inside are a little rough. You can do the inside better on the next one." Maya nodded. "I know." She paused. "That's the whole thing, isn't it? The next one is always better than the one before." Dara looked at her daughter. "Yes, that's the whole thing." Maya was already thinking about what she wanted to build next. She mentioned, a few days later, that she was thinking about a box with a hidden compartment. She had looked up how it was done, and it was more complicated than regular joinery, but she thought she could manage it. Dara said she thought so too. There was a morning in February, a month after the center opened, when Dara arrived before the rest of the staff and walked through the building alone. She did this sometimes. She went room by room, from the entrance hall up through the floors to the operating theater, and then back down through the basement to the east corridor, through the storage room, through the hidden door, down the 17 stairs. The vault was different now. Lit properly, labeled, the empty spaces where pieces had been returned marked with explanatory plaques that told where they'd gone and why. The flat drawers were archival mounted behind glass. Frederick's journal, digitized and translated, was accessible at a reading station near the entrance. The work table was still in the center of the room, the wooden box on it, open, lid raised, both key rings hanging from the brass clasp. She stood in the center of the room and looked at Frederick Harmon's workspace. She had a habit now, when she came down here alone, of reading one journal entry. Just one, standing at the reading station with her coffee, before the day started. She'd been working through them in order from the beginning. She was in 1939 now, the Paris years, when Frederick had been corresponding most actively with Louis Renard. The entries from that period were longer, more urgent. Europe was different by then, and Frederick's writing showed it. The sentences shorter, the notes after each acquisition more terse, as if he was running out of patience for elaborate documentation and needed to capture the essentials before conditions changed again. She read one this morning about a woman named Helena who sold a small bronze through an intermediary, never meeting Frederick directly. The intermediary had conveyed that Helena had said the bronze had been in her family for 3 generations, and she hoped it would be in someone's family for 3 more. Dara looked at the plaque on the shelf where the bronze had sat. Helena's bronze was now in the collection of a museum in Krakow, where it was part of a permanent exhibition on Jewish cultural life in Central Europe before the war. The museum had written Dara a formal letter of thanks that was framed on the wall of her office upstairs. They had also sent a photograph of the bronze on its display pedestal, and the lighting in the photograph was excellent, the kind of lighting that showed what an object was actually made of. 3 more generations, at minimum. Helena had been right. She thought about the chain of people across 82 years. Frederick, Margaret, Eleanor, Celestine, herself. She thought about what it meant that 4 people across 82 years had chosen to wait rather than act, had passed the weight of the decision forward rather than resolve it themselves. She'd understood it, at first, as a failure of nerve. A series of people who couldn't do what needed doing. She understood it differently now. They had been waiting for conditions that didn't exist in their time. The legal frameworks for restitution that existed now hadn't existed in Eleanor's time. The databases and registries that allowed Daniel Voss to cross-reference 6 matches in a single night had been built in the decades between Eleanor's death and this moment. The international cooperation between governments and museums and legal institutions that made restitution possible was newer than she was. Frederick had been right to preserve. Eleanor had been right to protect. Celestine had been right to wait. What they'd been waiting for, without knowing it precisely, was a moment when the infrastructure for honesty had caught up with the need for it. She was that moment. Not alone. Not because she was exceptional. Because she was here, in this place, at this time, with this particular set of skills and this particular set of people around her. She'd told Daniel Voss this once. He'd looked at her for a moment, and then said that he'd been thinking something similar. That the work of restitution was never one person's work. It was always the result of many people doing partial things over long periods of time, trusting that the partial work would accumulate into something complete. He'd been in the field for 20 years, and he was still only partway through the list of things that needed doing. What do you do with that? She'd asked. He'd shrugged. The same thing you do with any very long job. You do what you can today, and come back tomorrow and do more. She picked up the key ring from the wooden box. The large brass key, the small one. Worn smooth from 80 years of use before she came along, and from her own handling since. She turned them in her palm. Then she set them back down and climbed the stairs and went to open the center for the day. Maya was waiting in the entrance hall when she got there. She had come early, which she did sometimes on the days she wasn't in school, sitting in the entrance hall with a book or a sketch pad while Dara went through the vault or met with the research staff. She was standing in front of Frederick Harmon's portrait with her hands in her pockets, studying it the way she studied things she found genuinely interesting. She had a school project she'd mentioned a week ago, on people who preserve things, on why people decided that some things were worth keeping. She'd asked Dara for help choosing her subject, and Dara had suggested Frederick, and Maya had thought about it for 2 days before saying yes. She turned when she heard Dara on the stairs. The family in Edinburgh, she said. Are they coming to visit again? Ruth is coming in April. She wants to see the exhibit properly. Maya thought about this. Can I show her around? Yes. Of course you can. Her daughter turned back to the portrait. I've been thinking about what he wrote. Do it honestly. She paused. It's kind of a weird last thing to say. Dara stood beside her and looked at Frederick Harmon's face. Settled. Direct. I think it's the only thing worth saying, she said. When you've done something complicated and you're out of time to explain it. You just want whoever comes after to understand the basic principle. Maya considered this. Like telling me to be good when you drop me at school. Even if good is complicated. Exactly like that. Her daughter nodded, accepting this. Then she looked at the entrance hall around her, the tile floor and the staircase and the photographs on the walls and the light coming through the windows that were no longer boarded, that had been cleaned and repaired so that February light came through them clear and fell across the floor in long pale rectangles. Mom, do you think Grandma Celestine knew she was doing something important? When she kept the secret all those years. Dara thought about Celestine's letter. About the handwriting that grew closer together near the end, because she hadn't wanted to stop. I think she knew, she said. I think that's why it was hard. Because she understood what she was carrying, and she didn't feel equal to it. But she was. Yes, she was. Maya was quiet for a moment. She looked at the photographs on the wall, the ward room with the nurses, the dedication ceremony on the front steps, the formal portrait of Frederick in his white coat. It's the same as the hospital, she said finally. What is? The hospital kept people safe when they were at their worst. She gestured around the space. Now it keeps other things safe. She paused. It's still doing the same job. Dara looked at the entrance hall with her daughter's eyes for a moment. The hexagonal tile, some of it repaired now, some of it original. The grand staircase, its banister solid. The light from the windows. The photographs on the walls of all the people who'd worked here and been here and passed through this space across 103 years. Yes, Dara said. It is. Maya went to the reading station near the base of the staircase where a tablet displayed the digitized version of Frederick Harmon's journal, navigable by date and entry. She scrolled through it with the focused ease of a child who'd grown up comfortable with screens and stopped at the final entry. She read it. Dara watched her daughter read it. He just wanted someone to be honest, Maya said when she'd finished. That's all. That's all. Her daughter thought about this for another moment. Then she looked up at Dara. We were, though, right? Dara looked at her daughter. Looked at the building around them. Looked at the photographs and the staircase and the light coming through the windows and the 16 stairs going down to a room that had been waiting since 1942 for someone honest enough to open it. Yes, she said. We were. Then the rest of the staff began to arrive, and the day began, and there was work to do. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.